The glowing tree touched his forehead, and the verdict rang out over the crowd. The small settlement. Stage 1. 300 people fell silent, not out of surprise but out of shame. His father turned and walked away without looking back, and in that moment, the former engineer from Seoul realized he had found himself in a stranger's body, possessing the most despicable gift in the world. The cold hits his lungs like a bucket of ice water. Yoon Do-hyuk opens his eyes and recognizes nothing. Above him, a giant tree stretches toward the sky. Its top is lost in the clouds. The bark glows greenish from within. Thin threads stretch down from the branches toward the crowd in the stone square. He stands barefoot on the granite. The body is not his own. His arms are thin. His knees tremble. Someone's fingers dig into his shoulder. He turns his head. A man in his 50s, wearing an expensive dark robe, is looking at the tree, not at him. A branch reaches down toward his forehead, smooth, cold, like a surgeon's finger before an incision. And a window flashes in his mind, a translucent panel with text in a language he's never studied but reads fluently. The herald pronounces the verdict aloud, and the square falls silent. In this world, skill decides everything, and small settlement means you'll build a shed in a day and a fence in 2. A village gift for a village loser. Do-hyuk is left alone at the base of the tree, trying to remember his name. 2 names are in his head. One belongs to an engineer from Seoul who designed self-sufficient settlements in Southeast Asia and fell asleep at the wheel on Olympic Highway. The other belongs to a 16-year-old boy from the Yoon clan who was dying of typhus in a back room of the estate. Both are Yoon Do-hyuk. Both are him. He clenches someone else's fingers into a fist. His fingernails dig into his palm. The pain is real, so everything else must be real too. The next 3 months drag on like a feverish dream. His body remembers this world better than his mind does. His hands know how to hold chopsticks. His feet know which step to skip so it won't creak. And his mind remembers the formulas for beam loads. It remembers how to build a residential block for 40 people in the Mekong Delta in 11 days. The 2 kinds of knowledge cannot find common ground. The Yoon family estate is beautiful and cold. The servants walk past his door. His older brother, Yoon Tae-soo, looks right through him as if he were a pane of cloudy glass. His father doesn't look at him at all, and for good reason. Tae-soo received the 3rd-rank Blade of the North Wind, and his father threw a feast for 300 guests. His cousin, gifted with the ability of a high healer, was betrothed that very evening. Yet his own engagement is being called off in 6 weeks. He learns of the breakup from a servant who brings lunch and casually mentions that Lady Park has returned the gifts. The servant doesn't even apologize. It's no big deal. It's inevitable. And then his brother invites him on an autumn hunt. For the first time in 3 months, Tae-soo actually speaks to him. Do-hyuk goes along. His body holds a warm memory of how his older brother once taught the boy to shoot a bow. In the forest, Tae-soo suggests that he cross the ravine first. Do-hyuk takes 3 steps. The ground gives way beneath his feet. He falls from a cliff twice his height and lands on his right arm. The bone cracks like a dry twig. Tae-soo stands at the top and looks down, not with fear, with a critical eye. And right then, the engineer finally wakes up, not the boy who believed his brother loved him, the man who worked with contractors in Cambodia for 4 years and learned to see when you're being pushed out of a project. Tae-soo doesn't kill him. Tae-soo carries out a purge. A cripple with a small settlement skill is a legitimate reason to exile a younger brother to a distant plot of land. No inheritance. No name, no right of return. His arm heals crooked. The clan healer doesn't even come. 2 weeks later, his father summons him to his office, and the conversation lasts less than a minute. Do-hyuk receives a sack of rice, an old map, and the coordinates of a plot on the Paikun-hae Plateau. The sea of white clouds, a cursed plateau at the edge of the world where no one goes because there's nothing there. No water, no forest, no road. He walks for 4 days, alone, with his arm in a sling. The map lies at every turn. The road ends on the 2nd day, a trail on the 3rd. Beyond that, he climbs a rocky slope, clinging to ledges with his good hand. On the fourth day, he reaches the plateau, a flat plain at cloud level. The wind whips the short, stiff grass. No trees, no streams, no sign of human life. Hyuk sits down on a rock in the middle of this nothingness. He looks at his hand in the sling. He looks up at the sky, and he opens the skill interface. Building a simple shelter, building a fence, marking the territory. He scrolls further, and at the bottom, in small gray text, he notices a line he hadn't seen before. Blueprint mode. Locked. Requirement. Submit a structural plan of the settlement. He reads it 3 times. Not a house, not a shed, a settlement. He closes his eyes, and for the first time in 6 months, he does what he does best in the world. He sketches, in his head. A grid, 12 plots arranged in a circle. The plateau's slope is 1.5%, which means stormwater runoff flows to the northwest. So we'll place the well southeast of the center. Residential blocks arranged in an arc. A solid wall facing the wind. Windows facing east. Doors facing south. Joints, loads, materials, assembly sequence. And the interface is flashing. Drawing mode, unlocked. Auto-assembly based on the drawing is available. He opens his eyes. Instead of 3 meager lines, a full-fledged system unfolds before him. A coordinate grid, a list of materials, the assembly sequence, a strength indicator, and an inscription in the corner. 0 units of materials in stock. Do-hyuk looks at the empty plateau. He looks at the inscription. And for the first time in 6 months, he smiles. Where everyone else sees a shed and a fence, he sees a blueprint. A familiar problem. Skill doesn't create matter. Everything is assembled from what's been brought to the warehouse, but the warehouse is empty. He stands up and walks across the plateau, scanning every meter. The engineer within him is already at work. The grass is tough but long. It's good for making sheaves for the roof. Stone. The plateau is made of sandstone. You can chip it with a strong hand if you find the right crack. And at the edge of the cliff, a gully turns reddish. Rich clay. That means he can mold bricks and dry them in the wind. There's plenty of wind here. He pulls up the grass. He chips 3 dozen slabs with a sharp fragment used like a wedge. He digs up the clay with his boot and his hands. He hauls everything to the center of the future settlement. By evening, the first counts appear in the stockpile. 42 units of stone, 27 of grass, 14 of clay. Not enough for a wall, enough for a floor. He selects the smallest unit, a 2x2 area, a stone floor, 3 waist-high clay walls. He clicks confirm. The air above the area shimmers. The stones move on their own. Invisible hands pick them up one by one and place them neatly. The gaps are filled with clay. Grass settles on top. 20 minutes later, standing before him is something halfway between a pen and a trench. But the floor is level. The walls keep out the wind. And this is the first thing he's built in this world. He sits down inside. Leaning against the wall, he chews a handful of cold rice. Unfamiliar constellations light up over the plateau. His hand aches, the wind howls, and a blueprint unfolds in his mind. 12 houses, a well, a barn, a mill, a school, a wall, a tower, a city. He does the math. At this pace, the first residential block will take 80 days. With just one hand. But he's built villages in Cambodia and Vietnam, and he knows one thing for sure. People come to places where there's a roof and water. They arrive before the paint on the walls has even dried. It will be the same here. In the morning, he finds a stream, a thin one, gushing from beneath a stone slab. The water is icy cold and clear. He drinks, and for the first time in half a year, he cries. Not out of grief, but out of relief. Because a stream means life. It means he can stay here. He wipes his face with his sleeve and returns to the construction site. All day long he breaks rocks, digs up clay, and cuts grass. By evening he has twice as many materials. He begins the second phase of construction, a wall with a roof. But on the third day he collapses. He lay face down in the mud. The arm beneath his body felt like it was on fire. His vision swam. His body had given out. His 16-year-old body, which had survived typhus just a month ago, wasn't built for this kind of work. He lay on the ground until noon. Then he rolled onto his back. Above him stretched the white sky of the plateau, high and empty. Hyuk lay there and counted. 2 days of work, 90 units of stone, 40 units of clay, 50 units of grass. That was enough for the foundation and one wall with a roof overhang. A full-fledged living quarters would require 10 times as much. With one hand, without food, without tools. The rice would run out in 4 days. He could die here. The thought came calmly, like a line in a calculation. The probability was high. Resources were at 0. There would be no reinforcements. But the engineer in him didn't know how to give up. The engineer in him knew how to change the plan. He sat down, slowly. His head was spinning. He opened the interface and began reviewing the blueprint. Not to build more or faster, to build smarter. He remembered his first project in Cambodia, a village for 40 families. The budget had been cut by a factor of 4 a week before construction began. The foreman had hit the bottle. 2 trucks loaded with materials had sunk while crossing the river. And yet they built it anyway. Because he had reworked the design to fit what was available, not what he wanted. It's the same here. He stripped everything unnecessary from the blueprint. No 12 houses, just one. One residential unit, but the right one. With a stove that heats 2 walls at once. With a roof at the right angle so the rain runs into the gutter. With a door facing south so the morning sun warms the room. The minimum viable product. He smiled. There was dust on his lips and a taste of blood. In this world, no one knew what an MVP was. But the Pakune Plateau was the perfect testing ground. For the next 5 days, he worked 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the evening. He slept in the middle of the day. He took care of his body. He took care of his hand. He took care of his rice. He stretched his rations to last 6 days instead of 4 by adding the roots of a tough grass, which turned out to be edible, to his porridge. Bitter, but edible. On the 4th day, he finished the walls of the first block. On the 5th, he put up the roof. On the 6th, he built a stove. It wasn't a stove in the usual sense, just a stone box with a clay pipe leading through the roof. But it worked. There was a draft. The smoke rose upward. And when he lit the first fire inside with dry grass, the room began to warm up. The interface flashed. Settlement, level 1. First residential structure completed. Bonus, self-sustainability activated. He didn't immediately understand what that meant. In the morning, he saw it. The crack in the wall he'd noticed the night before had disappeared. The clay in the crack was fresh, wet, as if someone had patched it up during the night. There was no one there. He was alone on the plateau. The skill had repaired the wall itself. It had taken clay from the storage and patched the damage. Do-hyuk sat on the floor of his house and stared at the smooth wall for a long time. Then he laughed, hoarsely, with a sob, but he laughed. The rice ran out on the 7th day. He spent the 8th day by the stream trying to catch fish with his bare hands. He didn't catch any. He found a patch of wild onions on the bank, in bushes with small, sour berries. It wasn't food, it was survival. On the 9th day, he cleared a space in front of the house and laid out 3 words with stones, large ones, visible from the trail. There is water. There is a roof. It wasn't an announcement. It was an offer. He knew that trails existed on the plateau. Caravans take a detour through the pass. Refugees were wandering from the north, going wherever their eyes took them. Someone would see it. Someone would come. He waited. On the 10th day, no one came, nor on the 11th. He chewed on wild onions and berries. He dug up clay. He chiseled stone. He built a second block. This one was smaller than the first, 2 by 3 meters, a storage shed, a place to put what isn't there yet, an empty room for future supplies. He built it in a day and a half. On the morning of the 13th day, he saw movement on the eastern slope. 5 figures. They were walking slowly. One figure was carrying something in its arms, something small, wrapped in a rag. Do-hyuk stood by his house and waited. The old man was the first to climb up. Tall, stooped. His hands were large with gnarled fingers. A carpenter. Do-hyuk figured this out from his hands even before the old man spoke. Behind the old man walked a young woman with a face gray with exhaustion. A child lay in her arms. The bundle didn't move. Two boys, about 10 years old, brought up the rear. Dirty, barefoot. Their eyes were empty, like those of beaten dogs. The old man stopped 3 steps away from Do-hyuk. He looked around at the house. He looked at the sign. He looked at Do-hyuk himself, a skinny 16-year-old boy with a splint on his hand and clay under his fingernails. The old man said they'd been walking for 6 days, that their village had been burned down, that his son had died, that his daughter-in-law was carrying his grandson, that his grandson was sick, that the boys weren't his, but he'd picked them up on the road because he couldn't walk past them, and that if the young master would give them a place by the wall for just one night, they'd leave in the morning and wouldn't be a burden. Do-hyuk listened. Then he walked over to the woman. He asked to see the child. She unfolded the rag. A boy, about 8 months old. His face was red, his breathing was wheezy, wet, shallow. Do-hyuk wasn't a doctor, but he'd worked for 4 years in villages in Southeast Asia, where the nearest doctor was an 8-hour drive away. He knew what pneumonia looked like in infants. This was exactly it. He turned to the old man. He said they needed a room. Not a spot by the wall, a room for the child. Do-hyuk didn't set out to build a residential block. He sat down on the ground, he closed his eyes, and began to sketch in his mind. Not a plan for a house, a plan for a room for this specific child. A window facing east, the morning sun, warm and gentle. The child needs light, but not heat. A low ceiling. The lower it is, the faster the air warms up. 2 meters, high enough to stand up. Low enough to keep the heat from escaping. A wall adjoining the stove in the main block. Hot all night long. Made of stone, it will radiate heat like a radiator. A slit in the floor by the far wall. Narrow, pointing toward the center of the room. If he placed a pot of herbal decoction on the grate above the stove, the steam would travel through the crack straight to the child's bed. An improvised inhaler. The bed against the warm wall. Raised 20 centimeters off the floor. Not on the floor, so the cold from the stone wouldn't seep up from below. He opened his eyes. He looked at the materials inventory in the interface. There was enough stone. There was enough clay. Just enough. But there was enough. He clicked confirm. Invisible hands began to work. The old man watched. The woman watched. The boys watched. Stones flew through the air. Not quickly, smoothly, as if carried by a careful giant. The wall rose from the ground, row by row. Clay filled the joints. The roof settled into place on its own, tightly, evenly, without a single crack. 40 minutes. The room stood ready, warm from the stove wall, with a window from which one could see the sun rising over the ridge. Then, Hyuk went inside. He checked the steam pressure. It was working. He checked the temperature of the wall. Warm, even, no hot spots. He went outside. He took the child from the woman's arms. She didn't resist. She could no longer resist. He carried the boy into the room, laid him on the bed, covered him with his blanket, his only one. He placed a pot of water and herbs on the grate. 5 minutes later, the room was damp and warm. The child was still breathing hoarsely, but more evenly. The old man followed him in. He stood in the middle of the room. He looked around, at the wall by the stove, at the east-facing window, at the bed raised above the floor, at the steam vent. The old man had been building houses for 40 years. He had seen hundreds of houses, maybe 1,000. He had never seen a room that cared for the sick. The old man sat down on the floor, and he cried. Quietly, silently. Only his shoulders shook. Do-hyuk sat down beside him. He said nothing. There was no need to speak. A woman came in and laid down next to her son. The boys huddled in a corner and fell asleep instantly. The first time in 6 days under a roof. Do-hyuk went outside. The night was cold. His blanket lay on top of the child. He didn't have a second one. He sat down by the wall of his first house and pulled his jacket tight around him. He looked at the stars. He counted in his head. 5 people. He needed a barn. He needed food. He needed more materials. He needed tools. He needed a second house, a third, a fourth, an old carpenter. He had a skill. Hyuk hadn't asked what kind. It didn't matter what kind. A carpenter is all about his hands. Hands mean speed. Speed is life. By morning, the child's fever had subsided. It hadn't gone away completely, but it had subsided. The boy opened his eyes. They were still cloudy, but he opened them. The woman was breastfeeding him and crying. The old man stepped out onto the courtyard. He looked at Do Hyuk. He said his name was Park Yong-gil, that his skill was faithful plain, third level, that it was a carpentry skill, and that, if the young master would allow it, he'd like to stay. Not just for the night, for good. Do Hyuk said he would allow it, and that the young master's name was simply Do Hyuk, and that he needed help because you can't build much with just one hand, you can't build much. The old man nodded. He took a hatchet from his belt and went to chop down the bushes on the slope. By evening, a mountain of branches and poles lay on the site. The interface updated. Softwood, 112 units. 2 boys were hauling stones. Not because they'd been asked to, because they'd seen Do Hyuk hauling them with one hand, and they felt ashamed. By nightfall, there were enough materials for a second living quarters. Do Hyuk had sketched it out in his head. For the old man. Large, because a carpenter needs space for his tools. A wide door to bring in long planks. Hooks on the wall for an axe and a saw. A shelf by the bed at arm's length because an old man shouldn't have to bend over every time. By morning, the second house was finished. Park Yong-gil went inside. He saw the hooks for tools. He saw the wide door. He saw the shelf by the bed. He stepped outside. He looked at Do Hyuk. He asked how he knew how a carpenter lived. Do Hyuk said he'd worked with carpenters his whole life. That was true. In both of his lives. By evening that day, 12 more people had arrived on the plateau. A family of 5. 2 men carrying bags. A woman with 3 children. A lone young man with a scarred face. The news spread faster than the wind. Somewhere on the cursed plateau, there's a house. There's water. There's a roof. And someone is building for free. In 2 weeks, the settlement had grown to 32 people. Until then, Hyuk hadn't counted them himself. The interface did the counting for him. 32 residents, 7 residential blocks, 1 warehouse, 1 barn, 1 communal hearth, 1 well. The well was the hardest part. Not because it had to be dug deep, because they had to find the right spot. Do Hyuk spent a whole day walking across the plateau with a twig, not for divining, to measure the soil's moisture. He stuck the twig into the ground every 10 steps and checked how quickly the clay on the tip dried. Where it dried the slowest, that's where the water was closest. The refugees looked at him as if he were crazy. A skinny boy walking across a field, poking at the mud with a stick. Park Yong-gil didn't look. Park Yong-gil was simply waiting. He could already picture the room for the sick child. He knew this boy never did anything without a reason. The well yielded water at a depth of 4 meters, cold, clean, and with a hint of minerals. Do Hyuk lined the walls with stone masonry to keep the earth from crumbling and installed a wooden gate. The first day the water poured into a bucket was a celebration. No one declared it a holiday. People simply stopped working and stood around the well, drinking. Some drank and cried. For people who had walked 6, 10, or 15 days along parched roads, their well meant more than just water. It meant they were no longer walking. They had arrived. Do Hyuk watched them and thought of the village in the Mekong Delta. It was the same there. The first well. The first tears. The first moment when people stopped being refugees and become residents. The settlement grew. Every new building, every new resident. Every day the buildings were used. All of this fueled progress. By the end of the second week, the small settlement had reached the second tier. The interface unlocked a new feature. A cascade of specializations. Do Hyuk read the description 3 times. Every new building with a specific function creates a slot for a resident with the appropriate skill. A mill attracts millers, a smithy attracts blacksmiths, a library attracts scribes, and more importantly, whose skill matches the building receive a 1 or 2 level boost while they're in the settlement. He reread the last line. Skill boost. That changed everything. Park Yeon-gil was a level 3 skilled carpenter, a good skill for a village carpenter. But in a settlement with a proper workshop, he could reach the 4th or even 5th level. And a 5th level carpenter doesn't just build stools. It's house frames, roof trusses, bridges. Do-hyuk found the old man on a hillside where he was chopping brush. He told him about the waterfall. The old man listened in silence. Then he asked what was needed for that. Do-hyuk said they needed a workshop, a real one, with a workbench, tools, and space for long planks. The old man nodded and began chopping faster. They built the workshop in 3 days. It was the first building Do-hyuk had designed not for living, but for work. A wide entrance with double doors, an earthen floor packed down to the hardness of stone. 2 windows facing north so the light would be even, without shadows. A workbench along the long wall, shelves for tools, a pit in the floor for storing long logs. When Park Yeon-gil entered the workshop and placed his hands on the workbench, something happened. Do-hyuk saw it in the interface. Slot activated. Park Yeon-gil, faithful planer, level 3. Settlement bonus, +1 level. Current efficiency, level 4. And the old man sensed it. He stood by the workbench and looked at his hands. Then he picked up the hatchet. He walked over to the log, and with a single stroke, he shaved off a sliver so thick and long that it lay on the floor in a straight strip from the walls to the wall. The old man looked at the shavings. He looked at the hatchet. He looked at Do-hyuk. He said that something like this had happened to him only once in his life, in his youth, when he was building his first house, and out of joy, it seemed as though the wood yielded of its own accord. Do-hyuk nodded. He understood. The skill didn't just grant strength, it restored the master to his best self. The next problem was food. 32 people. The rice supplies the refugees had brought with them were running out. Wild onions and berries wouldn't feed so many mouths. They needed grain. They needed vegetables. They needed meat. Do-hyuk gathered everyone in the clearing by the well, their first gathering. He didn't call it a gathering. He said he wanted to talk. Everyone came. They sat on rocks and logs. They waited. Do-hyuk said they needed food, that there were wild goats on the plateau. He'd seen tracks on the southern slope, that there were wild grains, small and bitter but edible, that the soil on the eastern side of the plateau was softer and darker. They could try planting something there, that he needed people who knew how to hunt, people who knew plants, and people who could go down to the nearest village and buy or trade grain for stone. There was plenty of stone on the plateau. Down below, stone was worth money. 3 hands went up. A man named Kang Do-sik, a former hunter, first-level silent arrow skill. One of those skills that weren't respected back home. First level means you can hit a deer from 10 steps away, not 50. But here on the plateau, the goats came close because no one had hunted them for hundreds of years. 10 steps would be enough. A woman named Oh Soo-yeon, first level modest garden skill. Another disgraceful skill. First level means that the garden plot she tends yields 1/3 more than usual. Not twice as much. Not 5 times as much, 1/3 more. Down in the rich lands, that's nothing. Here, on the poor, rocky soil of the plateau, it's the difference between life and starvation. And a guy with a scarred face. His name was Chi Min-ho, second-level quiet fire skill. He could ignite a flame with a snap of his fingers, a small one, enough for a campfire, not for battle. Down below, with a skill like that, they work as a blacksmith's apprentice, serving as a human lighter. Here, he could fire bricks. The clay on the plateau was good, rich, dense. But bricks dried in the wind crumbled after a month. Fired ones last for years. Do-hyuk looked at these 3. Silent arrow, modest garden, silent fire. 3 skills that all of Samgyeong considered trash. And he saw in them a hunter who would feed 32 mouths, a gardener who would grow the first harvest, a master of fire who would give the city eternal walls. He told them this, in his own words, without fanfare. He simply explained what he needed and what they were capable of. Kang Do-sik silently took a bow and went to the southern slope. He returned in the evening with 2 goats on his shoulders. 32 people ate meat for the first time in weeks. Oh Soo-yeon marked out the garden beds on the eastern side the next day. No seeds yet, but the soil was dug up and ready. Chae Min-ho built the first kiln in the backyard of the warehouse. It was crude, small, but it worked. The first batch of fired bricks came out 3 days later. Red, resonant, strong. Do-hyuk picked one up. He turned it over in his hand. He tapped it with his fingernail. The sound was right, dry, clear, no dead spots. He almost started crying again. Bricks, real bricks. You could build forever with these. He revised his plan. Now the first buildings made of stone and clay would gradually be replaced by brick ones. Not all at once, step by step. First, the granary, because grain can't be stored in damp conditions. Then the warehouse, then housing. Progression. Every replacement feeds the skill. Every skill level unlocks new possibilities. Possibilities attract people. People bring resources. Resources allow for construction. Construction builds the skill. A virtuous cycle. A flywheel. He'd seen this pattern in all his projects. Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos. Once the flywheel starts spinning, there's no stopping it. The only question is whether there will be enough time before someone from the outside tries to stop it. By the end of the 3rd week, 47 people were living on the plateau. A caravan from the village lower down the slope brought a sack of millet and 2 sacks of barley in exchange for a batch of fired bricks. A good trade. The bricks cost more than the grain. But Do-hyuk needed grain, not money. Oh Soo-yeon planted the barley in the eastern garden beds. The first sprouts appeared 5 days later. Do-hyuk built her a greenhouse, a primitive one. Stone walls and frames with mica instead of glass. The boys had found the mica in a crevice on the northern slope. Thin, transparent plates. Not glass, but it let light through. Oh Soo-yeon went into the greenhouse. She stood there for a moment. Then she came out. She said that the temperature inside was like back in the south, where she was from, and that if the young master would allow it, she'd try planting a pumpkin there. Do-hyuk said he would allow it, and that his name was Do-hyuk, not young master. She nodded, and she continued to call him young master for another 3 months. The first time he was called village head was toward the end of the 3rd week. It was Park Young-gil who did it, in passing. He said that the village head had ordered logs to be prepared for the new house. Do-hyuk heard it and didn't correct him. Because it was true. He was the village head. Not by appointment, not by blood, by fact. He decided where to build the house. He decided who would build what. He allocated resources. He drew the plans. Everyone else built. That's how a settlement works. That's how every project in his past life worked. There is the one who draws the plans and those who build. And together, they are more than the sum of their parts. Toward the end of the 1st month, the caravan climbed the eastern slope. Not 5 people, not 10, 23. Women and children and the elderly, and 3 men with weapons. Leading the way was a wagon loaded with books. Not grain, not cloth. Books. Do-hyuk stood by the well and watched as the cart crawled up the rocks. The wheels creaked. The horse wheezed. The books shook on the bumps. Someone had tied them down with ropes so tightly that not a single one could fall out. Someone loved these books. The caravan stopped on a clearing. A woman stepped out from behind the cart. She was short and thin. Her dark hair was tied back in a bun. A small book was tied to her belt with a string. Her face was calm, but there were dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep. She surveyed the settlement, the houses, the well, the workshop, the barn, the kiln from which smoke was rising, the greenhouse on the eastern slope, the vegetable. Children playing by the wall. Old man Park planing a board on a workbench through the open workshop door. She watched for a long time. Then she turned to Do-hyuk. She said her name was So-rin, that she was the daughter of So Jung-ho. Do-hyuk didn't know that name, but his body knew. His body shuddered. Seo Jun-ho. the court historian of the kingdom of Namhe, executed 2 years ago for writing a treatise arguing that the Tree of Destinies does not distinguish between people by blood, that a lack of skill is not a punishment, but simply a different path. He was executed in the capital's main square. His books were burned. His daughter was expelled from the palace. Sorin said she had been traveling with a caravan of refugees for a month, that the books were all she had of her father, that the relatives who took her in had kept the books in the basement, and they had begun to rot, that she had taken them and left because she couldn't bear to watch the mold devour her father's last words. She said this in an even voice, no tears, no tremor, like a report. Do-hyuk looked at her and saw, not what she was saying, what she wasn't saying. Dark circles under her eyes, so she isn't sleeping. A notebook on her belt, so she's writing everything down. A habit, because if you don't write it down, you'll forget. And you can't forget. Her fingers were stained with ink, so she writes even while traveling. She doesn't have any fingers left. They've been recorded. Her spine was straight, not out of pride, out of habit from sitting at a desk for many hours. She's a book person. She lives in texts. And her father's texts aren't just memories. They are her very self. Do-hyuk said she could stay. Sorin nodded. She asked if there was a place where she could store the books, somewhere dry. Do-hyuk didn't answer. He went to his room, sat on the floor, closed his eyes, and began to sketch. Not a book storage room, not a room with a shelf, a reading room. Her reading room. He recalled every detail he'd noticed during their 3-minute conversation. She's short. The shelves are at her height, no higher, so she doesn't have to reach. She reads in the morning. He could tell by the way she squinted at the rising sun, not out of discomfort, out of habit. The window faces east, large, so the morning light would fall on the table. She drinks tea. A book on her belt next to a leather pouch. He saw the pouch. Its shape and size suggested there was a cup inside. Small, personal. A niche in the wall by the table, for the cup, at the level of her right hand. She's right-handed. Ink on her right hand. The ceiling is higher than in apartment buildings. A reading room needs to breathe. A person who spends hours with books suffocates in a low-ceilinged room. 3 meters. Books. 216 volumes. He estimated by eye based on the cart. Shelves along 3 walls. The 4th wall is the entrance and a window. The distance between the shelves is 35 centimeters. Standard for medium-sized books. The lower shelves are wider for large volumes. The floor is wooden, not stone. Warmth for the feet. She'll sit here for hours. Her feet shouldn't get cold. He opened his eyes. He counted the materials. There weren't enough bricks. He had to take some from the supply intended for the new residential block. He took them. Construction took half a day, not 40 minutes like the child's room. The reading room was more complicated, larger. The wooden floor meant that Park Young-gil was working with skill. The old planed the boards while invisible hands laid them in place. Man and magic working together. It was beautiful. By evening, the reading room was finished. Then Hyuk called for So-rin. She entered. She stopped at the threshold. He watched as she looked around. At the shelves, just her height. At the east-facing window. At the niche in the wall. A small one. Perfectly sized for her cup. She took the cup out of the bag, placed it in the niche. The cup fit perfectly, as if the niche had been cast to her exact shape. So-rin stood with her hand on the shelf, motionless. Then she turned to him. Her expression was strange. Not gratitude, not surprise, recognition. As if she had been searching for this room her whole life and had finally found it. She asked how he knew she drank tea with her right hand. Do-hyuk said he had seen ink. She asked how he knew she read in the mornings. He said he'd seen her watching the sunrise. She was silent. Then she said one word, "Thank you." And her voice trembled for the first time all day. She stayed in the reading room until dawn. She was arranging books. Do-hyuk could hear her fall silent from time to time through the wall. He knew that during those pauses, she was crying over her father's books, which were no longer rotting. Do-hyuk didn't go in. Some grief requires solitude. In the morning, she came out. Her eyes were red, but her back was straight. She said that if he needed someone who could count and take notes, she could help keep the records. Do-hyuk said he really needed someone like that. That was true too. The settlement was growing faster than he could keep track of in his head. Within a week, So-rin knew the name of every resident, their skills, their age, where they came from, what they could do, what they were afraid of. She wrote everything down in her little notebook, and in the evenings, she recounted it to Do-hyuk. Not dry facts, stories. Park Yeon-gil had built houses in Hamgyong province for 30 years until the governor imposed a tax on craftsmen equal to half their earnings. He left in the night. Kang Do-sik was the youngest son in a family of hunters. His older brothers the names Mighty Bow and Hawk's Eye. He was given the name Silent Arrow. His father stopped taking him on hunting trips. Oh Soo-yeon ran away from the estate where she worked in the baron's vegetable gardens in exchange for food and beatings. Chae Min-ho came from a town that had been burned down by Hwaryeon's troops because it had too many residents with low skills. Emperor Gangchol called it a purge. Do-hyuk listened to these stories every evening, sitting on the steps of his house. So-rin sat beside him. Between them stood her cup of tea. She always brought two, one for herself, one for him. He didn't ask. She didn't ask. It was just the way it was. By the end of the 6th week, 120 people lived in the settlement. 14 residential houses, a workshop, a barn, 2 warehouses, a greenhouse, a kiln expanded to 2 chambers, a reading room, a communal hearth with a rain shelter. The area by the well had become a town square. It wasn't part of the plan. People simply began gathering there in the evenings on their own. To talk, to share news. Children played. The elderly argued. Someone brought a homemade drum. A town square is the heart of a village. Hyuk had known this from his time in Cambodia. A village without a town square is just a collection of houses. A village with a town square is a place. Life changed every day. The flywheel kept turning. New people brought new skills. New skills opened up new possibilities. Among the refugees came a young man with the steadfast potter skill, 2nd tier, an ordinary potter. But in a settlement with a kiln and the quiet fire skill, he made pottery that didn't break when dropped. Do-hyuk built him a pottery workshop. A woman with the long thread skill arrived, a weaver, 1st level. Downstairs, she had woven burlap. Here, in the warmth of the workshop with the right lighting and a good loom, which Park Yeon-gil had assembled in 2 days, she wove a dense fabric as smooth as linen. The cascade was working. The skills grew stronger. People could feel it. They came into the workshops and left them changed. Not literally, but something shifted in their shoulders, in their eyes. A man who had been called a failure his whole life suddenly discovered that his hands were capable of more than he'd been told. It was like restoring sight to a blind man. Only the blindness wasn't physical, it was social. And at the end of the 6th week, what Do-hyuk had both been waiting for and fearing at the same time happened. A cavalry unit rode up from the southern slope. 12 horsemen in light leather armor, a coat of arms on their shields, a crossed hammer. Baron Cho Byung-ho's men. They stopped at the edge of the settlement. The leader dismounted. He looked around. Then he declared that all the inhabitants of this place were required to return to Baron Cho's lands, immediately, or they would be returned by force. The 12 horsemen stood in the square by the well. The horses' hooves tapped against the cobblestones. The residents gathered around, quietly, without panic. But Do-hyuk saw mothers clutching their children. He saw men gripping the handles of their shovels. He saw Kang Do-sik standing by the workshop with a bow slung over his shoulder, not drawn, just on his shoulder. The senior horseman was named Hwang Jong-ryol, captain of Baron Chae Byung-ho's personal guard, a burly man in his 40s with a 4th-level iron fist skill. A combat skill, the real thing. One man like that is worth 10 peasants with shovels, and there were 2. Do-hyuk stepped forward, alone, unarmed, in a work jacket smeared with clay, a 16-year-old boy with his arm in a sling, standing before a squad of armed horsemen. Hwang Jong-ryol looked down at him. He asked who was in charge here. Do-hyuk said it was him. Hwang smirked. He said that Baron Che demanded the return of his peasants who had fled his lands without permission, and that if the village head did not hand them over voluntarily, the squad would take them by force. Do Hyuk did not answer right away. He looked at the horsemen. He was counting. 12 horses. Leather armor meant light cavalry, swords at their belts, spears in sheaths by the saddles. They were riding fast, traveling light, no supply train, no tents. They didn't plan to linger. Ride in, take them, ride out. He looked at the horses more closely. Their flanks were sunken. The foam on their lips had dried. They had been riding for a long time. The climb up to the plateau was hard on the horses. The animals were tired. People needed water, too. He turned to one of the orphan boys who had been the first to approach. He told him to fetch water for the horses. The boy ran off. Hwan frowned. That wasn't the answer he'd expected. Do Hyuk turned back to the captain. He said that the people here lived of their own free will, that he hadn't kidnapped anyone, that they had come of their own accord, that he had no soldiers, no army, and no intention of going to war with the Baron, but that he would not hand over the people who had come to him for help. Hwan dismounted. He was a head taller than Do Hyuk. He stepped forward. He placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. He didn't draw it. He just placed his hand there, a gesture that, in the language of warriors, signified a final warning. He said he had orders, that he didn't care about goodwill, that either the peasants would come out on their own, or he would go into the houses and drag them out. Do Hyuk nodded. He'd been expecting this. He'd been expecting it from day one. Anyone who built something on someone else's territory knew that sooner or later, someone would come along with a piece of paper or a sword and claim, "This is mine." In Cambodia, it was bureaucrats. Here, it was horsemen. The essence was the same. He took a step back, not out of fear, to get a better view. He raised his hand and activated his skill, not construction, not blueprint, self-sustainability. The interface allowed him to see every building in the settlement as an element of a single system. Every wall, every door, every stone. And he could change them, not rebuild them, adjust them in real time. The door of the nearest house slammed shut, all on its own. The bolt slid into the groove, without a hand. Hwan turned toward the sound, a second door, a third, a fourth. Throughout the settlement, doors were closing one after another. The shutters on the windows folded inward. The stones in the walls shifted closer together. The cracks between them were sealed with clay. The settlement was sealing itself off, like a living creature pulling its soft parts inside its shell. Hwan stood in the middle of the square and watched as the houses around him turned into monolithic stone blocks without a single entrance. Then Hyuk said calmly that it would be impossible to enter the houses. Hwan drew his sword. He approached the nearest wall. He struck. A fourth-level iron fist is no joke. The blow would have pierced right through an ordinary mud brick wall. A crack appeared in the brick wall, a small one, and the crack closed right before Hwan's eyes. Clay oozed out of the joints and filled the fissure in a split second. The wall stood before him, whole and unharmed. Hwan struck again, harder. Same result. A crack, healing, an intact wall. He struck a third time, and a fourth. Each time, the wall repaired itself faster than he could break it. Self-repair. Any structure tied to the settlement's core repairs itself if materials are in stock. There were enough bricks and clay in stock to repair the walls until evening, and until morning, and until the next evening. Hwan lowered his sword. He was breathing heavily. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from exhaustion. He had just struck the wall with a fourth-level skill, and the wall had prevailed. Do Hyuk waited for the captain to catch his breath. Then he said that fighting was pointless, that the walls would stand, that the people inside were safe, and that he didn't want to be Baron Cho's enemy. A boy brought buckets of water. The horses moved toward the water. The horsemen exchanged glances. They had come to take the refugees from the barn. They stood before a fortress that healed itself. This was not what they had been prepared for. Hyuk said something else. He said that the settlement's residents were free people, that they paid for their housing and food with their labor, not to the barren, but for themselves, that among them were those who had once lived on the lands of Cho, and there were those who had come from the north or the east or from the cities. They were all here because they had nowhere else to go. And he proposed something else: trade. The settlement makes bricks that don't crumble, dishes that don't break, fabric as thick as linen. All of this can be bought, for grain, for iron, for tools. It's more profitable for the baron to trade with the settlement than to wage war. Juan remained silent. He had no authority to make such decisions. He had authority over swords, but swords didn't work. He mounted his horse. He said he would convey the village elder's words to the baron, but that the baron wasn't used to being refused, and that next time there wouldn't be 12, but 120. Hyuk nodded. He said he would wait, and that there was water on the way back by the stream on the southwestern slope. Juan looked at him strangely. Then he turned his horse around and led the detachment down the slope. The 12 horsemen rode off. The settlement breathed a sigh of relief. 2 doors swung open. Shutters flew open. Children ran out into the square. Some were crying. Some were laughing. Old Man Park stood by the workshop, shaking his head. So Rin approached Hyuk. She said nothing. She held out a cup of tea. He took it. His hands were shaking. She saw that. He knew it too, but neither of them said a word. The tea was hot, bitter, made with herbs that Oh Soo-yeon had gathered on the hillside. He drank it in one gulp. So Rin took the cup back. She went into the reading room. He stood in the square and counted in his head. 12 horsemen, that's reconnaissance, not an attack. The Baron wanted to see what he was dealing with. Now he knows. And next time, it will be different. Juan said 120. Maybe he exaggerated. Maybe not. Baron Cho, according to rumors, has 300 men. Half of them have 2nd and 3rd level combat skills, 24 at the 4th level. The Baron himself, according to rumors, is at the 5th level. Against this, Hyuk has walls that repair themselves. And that's it. Not a single fighter, not a single combat skill. Kang Du-sik with a bow and a 1st level silent arrow. This isn't an army. It's a joke. He needs time. Time for the walls to get thicker, for more people to arrive, for his skill to grow, for the cascade of specializations to attract someone with combat skills. A guard, a soldier, anyone. He spent the evening working on a blueprint, not for houses, for walls. He redesigned the outer perimeter of the settlement. Instead of separate houses standing apart, he connected them into a single line, a wall made of houses. Every residential block on the outer ring became part of the defensive wall. A solid wall facing outward, doors and windows facing inward, brick lintels between the houses, one continuous wall along the perimeter. And inside, everything remained the same: the square, the well, the granary, the workshops. But from the outside, it was a fortress. He showed the blueprint to Park Young-gil. The old man looked at it for a long time. He ran his finger along the line of the wall. He asked how many bricks would be needed. Hyuk named a figure. The old man whistled. He said it would take a month's worth of kiln firing to produce that many. Hyuk said they might be able to do it in less than a month. The old man nodded. Then he went to see Che Min-ho. By morning, the kiln was running around the clock. Min-ho slept 4 hours at a time and ate by the kiln. His silent fire skill kept the temperature steady. No fluctuations, no overheating. The bricks came out perfectly uniform, red, resonant, and smooth. In a week, the settlement was transformed. The houses on the outer ring had been moved closer together. The lintels were in place. The wall was complete. Not very tall, 2.5 meters, but solid and self-healing. Hyuk stood on the hill above the settlement and looked down. A circular wall of red brick. Inside, courtyards and roofs and smoke rising from chimneys. The gate to the east was the only entrance. It was no longer a settlement. It was a fortress. Small, but a fortress nonetheless. And just at that moment, as he stood on the hill and allowed himself to think that maybe everything would work out, he saw dust on the southern path. Not a cavalry unit, foot soldiers, a long column. The people walked slowly, with difficulty. Some were limping, some were being carried. There were many of them. He counted them as the column turned on to the ascent. 60, 80, 100. More than 100. Refugees. But not ordinary ones. They were coming from the south, from the direction of Baron Chui's lands. And some of them had burns. Do Hyuk ran down the hill. He met the column at the foot of the slope. At the front walked a middle-aged man with a bandaged head. He was carrying an unconscious woman on his back. Behind him, a boy of about 12 was leading a blind old woman by the hand. The man stopped. He looked at Do Hyuk. He said that Baron Cho had burned down 3 villages, his own villages, his very own, as punishment. The people had gone to the rebel on the plateau, so the villages were no longer needed. Let them burn. Let everyone see what happens to those who leave. Do Hyuk listened. He stood on the road and listened. 113 people. Women, children, old people. Scorched, hungry, without food, without water, without anything. The Baron burned their homes to prove that settling on the plateau was dangerous, and by doing so, he drove another 100 people straight to Do Hyuk. He didn't know whether to cry or laugh. He turned toward the gates. He shouted for them to open everything, the granary, the storerooms, the kitchen, to heat water and bring blankets. So Rin was already at the gate. With a notebook in her hand, she was counting, writing down names, ages, skills, injuries. Park Yun-gil was hauling planks for makeshift cots. Oh Soo-yun was running with a sack of herbs for bandages. Chae Min-ho was stoking the fire under the cauldrons with a single flick of his wrist. The town was working, like a well-oiled machine. Everyone knew their place. Everyone did their part. No orders, no shouting. They just did it. Do Hyuk stood at the gate and let people through. He counted in his head, 233 residents, plus 113, 346. The granary will last 2 weeks, maybe 3 if we conserve. No bricks, they're all gone, used for the wall. We need to build new houses, 10 at least, better yet, 15, in a week. With what? He didn't know, but it was a familiar challenge. The budget had been cut, no materials, too many people, deadlines looming. Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, same thing every time. And every time, he found a way, because there was no other choice. He sat down by the gate, took out a stick, began sketching in the mud. 15 houses, made of stone and clay, no bricks, temporary, for half a year. Then he'd replace them. But for now, let them stand. Let there be a roof. Rin came over. She sat down next to him. She held out a cup. He took it without looking. He drank and kept drawing. She watched his lines in the mud and wrote something down in her notebook. Later, he'll find out that she wrote down his words, words he'd spoken not to her, but to himself. I'm not building a city. I'm building a room for a specific person. A city is just all their rooms next to each other. She wrote this down because she understood. This isn't just a phrase, it's the whole of him. Do Hyuk hadn't slept for 3 days. 15 temporary homes made of stone and clay had sprung up in 6 days. He sketched each one separately. A family with 3 children. That means a partition inside and the children's area closer to the stove. A blind old woman. That means a level floor without a single threshold and a rope along the wall at arm's height so she can feel her way. A man with a bandaged head. A blacksmith. Second-level stubborn anvil skill. That means wide doors and space for the tools he carried on his back from the burning village. Every house remembered the resident's name even before the resident stepped inside. On the 4th day without sleep, Do Hyuk stood up from the blueprint and collapsed. His legs simply gave out. He sat on the floor of his house and couldn't get up. His hands were shaking. His vision was blurry. So Rin found him half an hour later. He was sitting on the floor, staring at the wall. She didn't say a word. She lifted him up, laid him on the bed, took off his boots, covered him with a blanket. He tried to say that he needed to finish the blueprint for the 14th house. She said the blueprint could wait. He said that people were sleeping on the floor in the barn. She said they'd been sleeping on the ground for 6 days, and one night in the barn wouldn't kill them. But if he died of exhaustion, it would kill them all. He wanted to argue, but his body decided for him. He fell asleep mid-sentence. He slept for 20 hours. When he woke up, Sorin was sitting at his desk, copying something from her notebook onto a large sheet of paper. He asked what it was. She said it was a list. Who could do what, who needed what, and what supplies were in stock. How much grain was in the granary? How many days until famine at the current rate of consumption? In 20 hours, she'd done what he'd been doing in his head. She'd transferred his system onto paper. He sat down on the bed. He looked at the list. He looked at her. He said it was good. She said it was necessary, and that if he was going to keep going without sleep for 3 days at a time, she needed to know his plan in advance because a dead village head was useless. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clenching the notebook so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She was afraid. Not for the settlement, for him. He could see it, and he didn't know what to do about it. His body is 16, his mind is 27, with Rin, 25. She sees before her a boy who works miracles and is killing himself with work. She doesn't know that inside this boy lives a grown man who hasn't taken a vacation in 4 years, and who, in a past life, died because he fell asleep at the wheel. The same mistake, and the same problem. He doesn't know how to stop. Do-hyuk got up. He ate. He went out to the square. The settlement was alive, without him. 20 hours without the village head, and nothing had collapsed. Park Yeon-gil finished building the 14th house by himself, without any skill, with his own hands, based on a sketch Do-hyuk had managed to draw before he collapsed. The house was crooked. The door creaked. The ceiling was a little lower than it should be, but it stood, and people lived in it. Kang Du-shik brought back 2 goats and a deer from the hunt. They smoked the meat in the backyard. Oh Soo-yeon harvested the first crop of barley from the greenhouses. A small one, 3 sacks, but the first. Chae Min-ho fired a new batch of bricks, and the new blacksmith with the stubborn anvil was already standing at the forge they'd built for him out of stones and clay, hammering away. Nails. Simple iron nails, made from scrap metal the refugees had brought. Broken knives, old horseshoes, scraps of chains. Everything was put to use. Nails. Do-hyuk stood by the forge and watched as the red-hot metal fell onto the anvil. Nails meant revolution. Before this, all joints in the settlement had been made with mortises and clay. Wood to wood, stone to stone, slowly, unreliable. Nails meant speed. Nails meant strength. Nails meant it was possible to build taller than 1 story. The blacksmith's name was Bae Jong-guk, stocky, taciturn. His hands bore old burns from the forge. He had the stubborn anvil skill at the 2nd level. Back home, with that skill, people made horseshoes and door hinges. Here in the settlement, with its tiered specializations, he worked at the 3rd level. And the 3rd level for a blacksmith isn't about hinges. It's about tools, axes, saws, chisels. Park Yeon-gil received a new axe on the 3rd day the smithy was open. He stood there with the axe in his hand, unable to believe it. The blade stayed sharp 3 times longer than usual. The balance was perfect. The handle fit his palm. Do-hyuk hadn't designed this axe. The blacksmith himself asked the carpenter what kind of tool he needed. People began talking to one another, master to master, without an intermediary. The flywheel spun faster. By the 2nd month, the settlement had surpassed 200 permanent residents. Refugees kept coming, not in a flood, more like a trickle. 2 or 3 people a day, sometimes a family, sometimes a lone traveler. Word spread along the roads of Samjeon. Somewhere on the cursed plateau there's a city. There, they build houses for free. There, they don't beat you for lacking skills. There's a well, bread, and work. It sounded like a fairy tale, but refugees who have nothing to lose believe in fairy tales. They have nothing left to lose. At the beginning of the 3rd month, a woman appeared on the Eastern Trail, alone, without a pack, without companions, with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder and a charcoal pencil tucked behind her ear. Short, wiry, short hair, pants instead of a skirt. Her hands were covered in scrapes and oil stains. She reached the gate, stopped, surveyed the wall, ran her hand over the brickwork, tapped it with her knuckles, bent down, looked at the foundation, straightened up, and she said aloud that the masonry was good, but the foundation was a bit too shallow for a wall of that height, and that if the builder planned to add more stories, the foundation would need to be deepened by at least half a meter. Otherwise, the wall would lean in strong winds. Do-hyuk was standing outside the gate and heard every word. He stepped out. The woman looked at him. A skinny boy of about down with clay under his fingernails. She asked if he was the one who built it. He said he was. She said her name was Han Mei, that she was an engineer, that she had come from the city of Jeonju, which Hwaryeon's troops had burned down 3 months ago. That in Jeonju she had studied at the Imperial Academy of Mechanics until she was expelled because women had no place among engineers. That for 7 years after that she had built mills and water wheels in the villages, and that she had heard about a settlement on the plateau where someone was building walls that heal themselves, and she had come to see because she didn't believe it. Until Hyuk asked if she believed it now. She said she did believe it now, but the foundation was still a bit flimsy. He laughed. It was the first time in 3 months he'd truly laughed. Not out of exhaustion, out of joy. Because standing before him was a person who had looked at his wall and seen not a miracle, but an engineering error. That meant she understood. He led her into the workshop. He unfolded the settlement's blueprint on the table. It was large, detailed, with notes and calculations. Han Mei leaned over it. She fell silent. Her eyes darted across the lines. She saw everything. The drainage system, the roof slopes, the load distribution in the ring wall, the connection between the residential blocks and the load-bearing lintels. She stood over the blueprint for about 5 minutes without saying a word. Then she looked up. She looked at Do-hyuk. And for the first time in 7 years since graduation, someone addressed her not as a woman with a hammer, but as a colleague. Do-hyuk said he saw a problem with the drainage in the northwest sector and asked her to look at the load distribution. He handed her a graphite pencil. As an equal, she took the pencil. Her hands trembled. She clenched her fingers tighter. She leaned over the drawing and began to make corrections. They worked late into the night. They argued, loudly, until their voices were hoarse. He said the load could be distributed through arched lintels. She said that with the local sandstone, the arch would crack within a year and buttresses were needed. He said the buttresses would eat into the material. She said a cracked arch would eat into it even more. Sorin brought them tea at midnight. She stood in the doorway and watched. 2 people were bent over the table, furiously poking their fingers at lines on the paper. It was the first time she had seen Do-hyuk like this, alive, not tired and determined, but simply alive, like a man who was finally speaking his own language. She set down the tea and left. She noted in her logbook that engineer Han Mei from Jeonju had arrived, and that for the first time in 3 months, the foreman had forgotten to eat dinner. Not out of exhaustion, but out of joy. By morning, the blueprint had been corrected. They spent 3 days deepening the foundation for the outer wall. Han Mei stood over the trench and gave orders, loudly, sharply. She cursed like a soldier when the stones weren't laid evenly. At first, the workers gave her sidelong glances, a woman in pants yelling at the men by the trench. But after a day, they stopped giving her sidelong glances, because she was right. Every single time. After being deepened, the foundation stood rock solid. The wall stopped swaying in the wind. Before Hyuk built her a workshop, a separate one, next to his own, with a large drafting table, with shelves for tools, with north-facing windows for even light. She walked in, stopped, looked at the table, ran her hand over the wood. Smooth. Park Yeon-gil had planed it. She set her canvas bag on the table. She took a bundle out of it. She unwrapped it. Tools, a compass, a set square, a ruler with markings. All old, worn, but well maintained. She laid them out on the table, each in its place, like a surgeon laying out scalpels. Then she turned to Do-hyuk. She said the table was nice, and that if he needed an engineer, she'd stay. Do-hyuk said he really needed an engineer. She nodded. She sat down at the table. She picked up a pencil and began to sketch a water wheel on a stream for a mill. Do-hyuk watched her lines and saw her handwriting. Confident, precise. 7 years of practice in the village. Every line knew exactly where it was going. He slipped out quietly. She didn't notice. She was at home. The mill started working on the 4th day of the 4th month. Han Mei assembled the water wheel in a week. Park Yong-gil carved the blades out of oak. Bae Jong-guk forged the axle and gears. Han Mei called the gears toothed circles. In all seriousness, Do-hyuk first heard this at a meeting. He choked on his tea. She looked at him and asked what else he would call them. He said, gears. She asked why gears. He said, because there are 6 teeth. She looked at her drawing. She counted the teeth. There were 8. She said, then there are 8 teeth. And she continued drawing. So Rin wrote down this conversation in her notebook. Later, Do-hyuk would read it and couldn't stop laughing. The mill stood on a stream downstream from the well. The water turned the wheel. The wheel turned the millstone. The millstone ground the grain. A simple chain of events. But for the settlement, it was like the arrival of electricity. Before that, grain was ground by hand, stone against stone. Women sat by the granary for hours grinding barley into flour. Now the mill did in an hour what hands did in a day. Oh Soo-yeon brought the first sack of flour from the mill to the square. White, fine, smooth. People stood around and touched the flour with their fingers. Some tasted it on their tongues. An old woman who had been grinding grain by hand for 20 years sat on a rock by the well and stared at the sack. Then she said that meant her hands weren't needed anymore. Do-hyuk said that hands were always needed, just for something else. The mill opened a slot in the cascade. The next day, a miller appeared on the trail, a 20-year-old man. He had the first-level skill, pure milling, a useless skill in an ordinary village. Here, next to the mill, he turned coarse barley into finely ground flour, which made the bread fluffy and soft. The cascade was working. The mill had attracted the miller. Next would be a bakery. The bakery would attract a baker. The baker would make bread. The bread would attract people. The people would bring resources. Just as Hyuk was building the bakery, So-rin arrived with news. A caravan from the south, a large one, 20 wagons, guards, and a woman at the head who was requesting a meeting with the village head. Do-hyuk wiped his hands. He walked toward the gate. The caravan was parked on the plaza in front of the wall. The wagons were loaded with bales of cloth, sacks of grain, and barrels of oil. Guards. 3 men with swords and weary faces, and a woman. She was sitting on the front wagon, about 28 years old, back straight. An expensive but dusty robe, her hair tucked under a traveling scarf. Her face was both beautiful and stern. Eyes that assessed everything around her and instantly put a price on it. A merchant's wife. Do-hyuk figured this out in 3 seconds. By her hands. Well-groomed but not pampered. Accustomed to both a paintbrush and reins. By her posture. Accustomed to sitting at a table across from people who lie. By her clothes. Expensive but practical. Not for beauty, for effect. She stepped down from the wagon. She approached him. She looked him up and down. A skinny boy in a clay-colored jacket. She asked if he was the builder with the small settlement skill. Do-hyuk said he was. She introduced herself. Lee Na, the widow of merchant Lee Jong-sok from the Southern Islands. She said her husband had died 2 years ago, leaving debts 3 times his fortune. That she had been paying off those debts for 2 years by trading on the roads. That the Southern guilds wouldn't let her sit at the table because she was a woman and a widow, not a merchant. She said she was invited to feasts merely as decoration, not as a business partner, and that she was leading a caravan north because all her paths in the south had been cut off. She said all this in a businesslike tone, without complaint, as if reading a financial report. Do-hyuk listened. Then he asked what she wanted. She said she wanted to trade. The settlement on the plateau makes bricks, pottery, and cloth. Down below, these are commodities. She can sell them. She needs a base, a place where the caravan can rest, restock, and move on. She proposes a deal. She sells the settlement's goods and takes 1/10 of the proceeds, The rest she'll pay back in grain, iron, and whatever else is needed. Hyuk thought for a minute. Then he said he agreed, but on one condition. He sets the prices, not her, because if the settlement's goods are too expensive, the people down below will get angry, and if they're too cheap, the settlement won't survive. A balance is needed. Lee Na looked at him. She had expected him to haggle. She had expected the boy to ask for more or less, or to start playing games. But he spoke of a balance in prices. She said she agreed. And for the first time during the conversation, she smiled, not the routine smile of a merchant, a genuine one, because for the first time in 2 years, someone was talking to her about business rather than whose widow she was. The caravan unloaded, 20 wagons of grain, oil, cloth, and iron, more resources than the settlement had gathered in 3 months. Do Hyuk watched the rising numbers on the interface and recalculated his plan. With this amount of materials, he could convert half of the temporary houses into permanent ones, install a second kiln, expand the workshop, finish building the bakery, and start what he'd been thinking about since day one, a school. But first, he built a trading hall for Lee Na, a large room next to the gates, with display cases for goods, with scales, with a storage room behind the wall, and with a chair in the center of the hall, not off to the side, in the center, because this is her hall. She is the mistress here. And above the armchair, he hung a coat of arms. Over dinner, he asked her about her maiden family. She spoke reluctantly. Her maiden family, the Na clan, was from the port city of Hassan, fishermen and sailors. The family's coat of arms had long been forgotten. She only remembered that it featured a wave and a star. So Hyuk drew it, a wave and a star, roughly, with charcoal on a wooden board, but recognizable. In the morning, the board hung above the armchair. Lee Na entered the trading hall. She saw the armchair. She saw the coat of arms. She stopped. She raised her hand and touched the board with the drawing. A wave and a star. The Na clan of Hassan. Her clan, not her husband's, hers. For the first time in 10 years of trading, someone had created a place for her where she could be herself. Not Lee Jong-suk's widow. Lee Na of the Na clan. She stood before the crest and wept, in front of witnesses, for the first time in 10 years. Then she wiped her face. She turned to the clerks, and in a voice that made them stand to attention, she began giving orders. The first caravan left for the lowlands in 3 days, with bricks, with pottery, with cloth. It returned a week later, with grain, with iron, with tools, and with news. Baron Cho is preparing an army. Not 12 horsemen, a full-fledged detachment. 300 spears, siege ladders, fire mages. He's hired mercenaries from a neighboring barony. Timeline, a month, maybe a month and a half. Lee Na reported this without emotion, like the price of barley. Do Hyuk listened. He calculated. 300 spears, siege ladders, fire mages. A wall 2.5 meters high won't hold. Self-repair can fix damage, but if there's too much damage at once, the system won't be able to handle it. We need a higher wall. We need towers. We need people who know how to fight. He doesn't have people who know how to fight. There's Kang Du-shik with a bow. There's a blacksmith with a hammer. There's a carpenter with an axe. Peasants with pitchforks. 300 trained soldiers will cut through them like a knife butter. Before that, Hyuk convened a council, his first real council, with Rin, Hanmei, Lee Na, Park Young-gil, Kang Du-shik, Bae Jong-guk, Chae Min-ho. 7 people around the table in the workshop. A blueprint of the settlement lay on the table. Do Hyuk spoke bluntly, that the Baron was coming, that they had a month, that they didn't know how to fight, and that he needed ideas. Silence. Then Hanmei spoke up. She said the wall could be raised to 4 meters in 3 weeks if they doubled brick production, and that she could make traps, mechanical ones, pits with stakes in front of the wall, crossbows on the walls. Not difficult,
just wood, ropes, and iron. Li Na said she could hire mercenaries, 10 swords, 20, expensive but possible. Do Hyuk shook his head. He said the mercenaries would leave after the battle. He didn't need swords for a week. He needed someone who would stay and build a guard post. So Rin looked up from her book. She said quietly that there was a woman among the new refugees. She arrived 3 days ago, alone, with a sword, tall, silent, a scar across her eyebrow.
She sleeps by the barn wall because she didn't ask for a house. So Rin wrote down her name, Son Yi-jin. She didn't mention her skill. So Rin said that judging by the way she moves, she's a fighter, a real one. Not some village bully with a 3rd-level skill, a soldier. Do Hyuk stood up from the table. He walked over to the barn. She was sitting against the wall, back straight, sword across her knees, eyes closed. But she wasn't asleep. You could tell by her breathing that she wasn't asleep. Tall, a head taller than Do Hyuk, thin but sinewy, a scar across her left eyebrow. Old, graying. Her hands were calloused from the sword hilt. Do Hyuk sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her. He said his name was Do Hyuk, that he was building this place, and that he'd noticed she hadn't asked for a home. She opened her eyes, gray, empty. She said she didn't deserve a home. Do Hyuk asked why. She was silent for a long time. Then she said she had been a junior officer in the Namhae Royal Guard for 10 years, and that 3 months ago she'd been ordered to slaughter unarmed refugees at the mountain pass, and that she'd refused. And that for that she'd been stripped of her rank, stripped of her title, thrown out onto the road, and that she hadn't come here looking for a home. She had come here to die. Because for 10 years she had defended the people who ordered her to kill those she had sworn to protect, and she didn't know how to live with that. Do Hyuk sat beside her. He was silent. Then he said one thing. He said there was no prison in his city, no whips. They punish with work and conversation, and that if she wants to, she doesn't have to die. She can stay and build a guard force that protects rather than kills. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said she'd think about it. Do Hyuk stood up. He left. The next morning, Song Yi-jin was standing at the gate, with a sword at her belt, upright, silent, like a pillar. So Rin approached her. She asked what she was doing. Yi-jin said she was standing guard. Do Hyuk found out about this at lunch. He didn't build her a barracks that day. He waited. A week later, she came to him on her own. She said she needed people, 10 to start with, from among the settlers. She would teach them to march in formation and wield spears. She wouldn't turn them into soldiers in a month, but she would build a wall of bodies that wouldn't run away. Do Hyuk said there would be 10, and then he built her a barracks. Without a punishment cell, with a common sleeping area, with an armory, with a training ground by the south wall. She walked in, looked around, saw that there was no punishment cell. She looked at Do Hyuk. He said he wasn't joking. She nodded, and for the first time in 3 months, something other than emptiness appeared in her eyes. Sun Yi-jin chose 10 people, not the strongest, the most stubborn. Kang Do-sik with his silent arrow, 2 guys from the burned villages who knew nothing but how to stand their ground and never give up. A woman in her 30s with a first-level stone hand skill, a useless combat skill. First level means the strike is just a little harder than usual. But Yi-jin said she didn't need skills. She needed people who wouldn't run away. Training began at dawn the next day. Do Hyuk could hear shouts coming from the training ground by the south wall. Yi-jin wasn't shouting. She spoke in an even voice. But because of that even voice, 10 people were running around the training ground, drenched in sweat, within half an hour. She taught them simply, him. Stand in a line. Hold a spear. Don't stick out. Don't run. The spears were forged by Bae Jong-guk, rough, heavy, but sharp. Iron tips, wooden shafts. Ye-jin inspected each one. She rejected 3. The blacksmith remade them without a word. He respected people who knew their craft. She knew it. While the guards trained, Han Mei set traps. Pits in front of the wall, deep, with stakes at the bottom. covered with branches and earth. 12 pits around the perimeter, between them strips of packed earth, narrow. One person could pass, not two in a row. Any army advancing toward the wall would be forced to squeeze into a column, and a column is easier to stop than a formation. On the walls, she set up crossbows, wooden frames with leather bowstrings. Simple, slow to reload. But with a range of 30 paces, leather armor wouldn't stop an arrow. Do-hyuk kept building the wall. 4 meters. 5. He realized that 2.5 meters was just a child's fence. It was taking 3 times as many bricks as he'd planned. Chae Min-ho worked at the kiln from morning till night. His silent fire skill kept the flame steady without fluctuations, but the young man was wasting away before his eyes. Do-hyuk noticed. He told Min-ho that he needed to rest. Min-ho said he'd rest once the wall was finished. Do-hyuk looked at him and saw himself. The same gaze, the same stubborn willingness to burn himself out for the cause. He didn't argue. Instead, he built a room next to the kiln, a small one, with a bed, so that Min-ho could sleep between firings without having to go far. Min-ho walked into the room. He saw the bed. He lay down. He fell asleep instantly. He slept for 4 hours. He went out. He stoked the furnace. He worked until nightfall. But now he slept at least 4 hours instead of 2. In the middle of the 4th month, the skill reached the 3rd level. The interface unlocked a new feature, a living plan. Do-hyuk read the description. The settlement remembers how it's used. It adapts. On its own. Without his involvement. He didn't believe it. In the morning, he saw it. Every day, the children ran from the square to the greenhouse along the path between the houses. It was muddy and washed out. That morning, a paved path lay in its place. Smooth. Stone. No one had built it. The skill had laid the stones itself during the night. That's why people use that path every day. Do-hyuk stood on the path and felt a chill run down his spine. His skill was learning, observing, memorizing, and drawing conclusions. It wasn't construction. It was something closer to a living organism. The settlement was breathing, growing. It was adapting. It was cold in the meeting hall in the mornings. Do-hyuk noticed, but didn't have time to fix it. 2 days later, additional chimneys appeared in the hall's walls, on their own. The heat from the communal hearth now flowed through the walls, the hall warmed up by dawn. Hanmei saw the new chimneys. She examined them. She tapped on the walls. She sat there for an hour, deep in thought. Then she went to Do-hyuk and told him that his skill had laid out the chimneys along the optimal route, one that would have taken her half a day to calculate herself. But the skill had done it overnight, and it did it better. Do-hyuk said that the skill wasn't smarter than an engineer. The skill simply saw people freezing and eliminated the cause. Hanmei said that was the very definition of good engineering, and that if she had a skill like that, she wouldn't sleep at all. Do-hyuk said he didn't sleep anyway. She looked at him and didn't laugh, because it was true. So Rin came to him that evening with 2 cups of tea. She sat down next to him on the step. She was silent. Then she said that Hanmei was right, that the settlement was alive, and that it was just like him. It worked without stopping. It repaired without complaining. It built without asking why. She said this quietly, looking at the square where children were playing on a paved path that hadn't been there yesterday. Do-hyuk drank his tea and remained silent. He didn't know what to say, because she was right, and that frightened him. The skill reflected him, his way of thinking, his way of caring, his obsession with every detail. The city was becoming his mirror. By the 5th month, 400 people lived in the settlement. The wall stood 5 meters high, solid, red brick. 4 towers at the corners, 2 gate towers at the eastern gate. 12 pit traps along the perimeter, 8 crossbows on the walls. Sun Yijin's guard had grown to 25 people, not an army, but people who wouldn't run away. Yijin trained them every day, morning, evening, no days off. She wasn't cruel, she was precise. Every comment was to the point. Every move was drilled to the point of second nature. Strike, block, step back, step forward, again, again, again. Do-hyuk dropped by the training session in the third week. He stood by the wall and watched. Yi-jin noticed him. After practice, she came over. She asked if he wanted to learn how to wield a sword. He said he had only one working hand. She said she knew a one-armed fighter who had killed 12 men in a single battle. It's not about the hands, it's about where you look. He agreed, not because he wanted to fight, because he understood. Sooner or later, he'd end up on the wall with no one nearby to wield a sword. She taught him in the evenings, after the guard's training. 30 minutes, no more. He was a poor student, a 16-year-old's body, weak from typhus and with a broken arm. But he was stubborn. His engineer's mind broke down every movement into vectors, the angle of impact, the fulcrum, the moment of inertia. Yi-jin said he moved like a man who thinks rather than feels. That's bad for a fighter, but good for a commander. After 2 weeks, she stopped teaching him how to strike. She began teaching him to see, where the attack would go, where the formation's weak spot was, where to expect to strike. He was better at that, seeing the system and finding the weak link. It was engineering, only instead of beams and loads, there were people and swords. At the end of the 5th month, a messenger ran up. A boy from a village at the foot of the plateau. Out of breath, dirty, he said one word. They're coming. Do-hyuk climbed the gate tower. He looked south. Dust, lots of dust. A column. He estimated the size by the width of the cloud. 200, maybe 300. Infantry, ladders. And in the center of the column, a banner, a crossed hammer. Baron Cho Byung-ho was leading the way himself. Do-hyuk came down. He called a council, quickly, standing. He said they had 2 hours before the enemy arrived. Yi-jin went to rouse the guards. Han Mei ran to check the crossbows. Lee Na began counting the supplies in case of a siege. Park Yeon-gil was locking up the workshop. Bae Jong-guk blew out the forge and grabbed his hammer. So-rin stood nearby with a book. She was writing it all down, everything. Until Hyuk climbed back up to the tower, alone. He watched the army approach. 250 lances. He hadn't been mistaken. Siege ladders, 6 of them. In the center was a horseman in dark armor, the Baron. The army stopped 300 paces from the wall. They set up camp. They waited. The night before the battle was quiet. No wind, no clouds. The stars hung over the plateau like a scattering of broken glass. Do-hyuk hadn't slept. He sat on the gate tower and watched the campfires below. 250 fires, one for every soldier. That's a lot. That's 10 times more than his guard. Yi-jin sat beside him, silently, with a sword on her lap. She wasn't looking at the camp, she was looking at the wall, scanning every section, every loophole, every crossbow. Do-hyuk asked how she assessed their chances. She said they were bad. 250 trained soldiers against 25 militiamen behind the wall. The wall is solid. The traps will slow them down. The crossbows will thin out the first wave. But if the Baron throws everyone at us at once, they'll scale the wall in an hour. Self-repair won't help. The wall heals its cracks. But it can't heal the people on the wall. Do-hyuk nodded. He knew. He'd figured it out too. And he had a plan. Not a military one. An engineering one. He'd spent the whole evening working on a blueprint, not for traps, for the wall. He'd redesigned the outer contour. Each section of the wall could now move, not the whole thing, individual blocks. The bricks could shift inward or outward by the width of a palm. That was enough to make a ladder lose its footing. If you leaned a ladder against a wall that moves, the ladder would slip. That was his trump card. Not swords, not arrows. A wall that won't let you lean against it. He climbed down from the tower, walked along the wall, checked every block, activated mobility mode. The interface showed the consumption. High. Every movement of a block drained resources from the warehouse. Clay, bricks, stone, to fill the gaps after the shift. He calculated the reserves. enough for 6 hours of continuous movement. If the battle dragged on longer, the wall would become completely stationary, and then the ladders would come into play. 6 hours. In 6 hours, he had to repel the attack or lose. Dawn broke gray. A thin layer of fog lay over the plateau. Do-hyuk stood on the tower, so Rin stood beside him. He asked her to go downstairs. She said no. He said it was dangerous up here. She said she knew, and she stayed, with a notebook in her hand. She was going to record the battle, because if they survived, someone had to remember how it was. And if they didn't survive, the notebook would remain in the ruins, and someday someone would find it and read it. Do-hyuk didn't argue. There was no time. The Baron sent a negotiator, Hwang Jong-real himself. He rode up to the gate alone, unarmed. He shouted from below, "Baron Cho Byung-ho is offering one last chance. The residents come out and return to the Baron's lands. The builder leaves the plateau and goes wherever he wants. No one will be harmed. Otherwise, there would be an assault." Before Hyuk could reply from the tower, Hwan said that the residents were free people and they would stay. He added that he was offering the Baron some tea. Hwan turned his horse around and galloped away. 20 minutes later, the army was in formation. First line, infantry with ladders, 6 ladders, 40 men on each. Second line, infantry with swords, reserve. Third line, cavalry, the Baron in the center. They set off, slowly, in an orderly fashion. The front ranks carried ladders on their shoulders. Behind them came the shield-bearers, providing cover against arrows. Professionals. Until Hayek counted the steps. 200. 150. 100. The first rank entered the trap zone. The ground gave way beneath their feet. Screams. 2 fell into a pit, then 3 more. The formation broke. Officers shouted. Soldiers stopped. They probed the ground with their spears. The traps slowed them down. They didn't stop them, but they slowed them down. They skirted the pits. They huddled into columns in the narrow passages. Just as Han Mei had planned. The crossbows fired, 8 at once, heavy arrows with iron tips. At 30 paces, they pierced the leather armor. 4 fell. Reloading. Slowly. Too slowly. While they were reloading, the first group reached the wall. The ladder was set up. A soldier began climbing. Before Hayek could activate the blocks, the bricks shifted. The top edge of the wall receded by a palm's width. The ladder lost its footing. It slid sideways. The soldier plummeted 4 meters to the ground. A second ladder. Same result. The wall was shifting. Not much, but enough to prevent the ladder from gaining a firm foothold. The soldiers below were cursing. They pressed the ladder against the wall and held it in place with their hands. The wall shifted to the other side. The ladder fell again. The Baron watched this from the third line. Do-hyuk saw him rise up in his stirrups. Then he shouted something. 5 men stepped out from the second line. Not infantrymen, others. Their hands glowed. Mages. Fire mages. Do-hyuk clenched his teeth. He wasn't ready for this. The first mage hurled a fireball at the wall. Bricks flew apart, a breach as wide as a man. The self-repair mechanism kicked in. The bricks began to crawl back into place. The gap closed, but slowly. A second strike at the same spot. Another breach. Wider. Repair again. But the supply of materials was dwindling. Every breach and every repair consumed bricks from the stockpile. The mage struck the same spot. Again and again. Each time the wall repaired itself. Each time a little slower. Supplies. Do-hyuk watched the numbers on the interface. Bricks. There were 900. Now 700. 600. 500. Each breach consumed 30 to 40 units. There were 5 mages. They were striking different sections. 5 breaches at once. The wall couldn't keep up. 400. 300. Do-hyuk closed his eyes. He thought, quickly. Mages strike the wall. The wall repairs itself. Mages strike again. Resource consumption. A dead end. We can't outmaneuver them head-on. We need to change the conditions. He opened his eyes, looked at the wall, looked at the mages. The mages were standing 30 paces from the wall to ensure accurate hits. 30 paces, within range of the crossbows. But the crossbows were firing at the infantry, not at the mages, because the infantry was closer and outnumbered them. He shouted to Han Mei. She was standing by the nearest crossbow. He told her to turn all 8 crossbows toward the mages. She understood instantly. She turned them. 8 heavy arrows struck the 5 mages. 2 fell immediately. 1 deflected an arrow with his shield. 2 jumped back. But while they were jumping back, the wall was being repaired. 5 seconds without attacks were enough to close all the breaches. The mages retreated 50 paces out of the crossbow's effective range. From there, they continued to attack, but with less accuracy. The shots landed haphazardly, 1 breach instead of 5. The wall held. The infantry advanced again, carrying ladders. Then Hyok activated the movable blocks. The wall shifted. The ladders fell. Soldiers fell. The wounded were already lying at the base of the wall. They were moaning. The commander's shouts drowned out the moans. The baron sent in the cavalry, not at the wall, at the gate. 20 horsemen with a battering ram. A log on chains between 2 horses. They charged the gate at full gallop. Do-hyuk saw it. He rushed toward the gatehouse. He didn't have time to reinforce the gate, but he could reinforce the bolt. He poured everything he had left into the gate's opening. Stone, brick, clay. Invisible hands built a barricade behind the gate leaves as the horsemen charged. The battering ram struck. The gate leaves buckled. But behind them stood a monolith of stone and brick a meter thick. The gate held. The battering ram bounced back. The horses reared up. The riders were thrown from their saddles. A second blow. The gate stood firm. A third. They stood firm. The battle lasted 4 hours. The wall shifted. The wall was being repaired. Ladders fell. Mages struck from afar. Arrows flew. Sun Yijin stood on the wall, pushing back those who managed to reach the top. Yijin fought, silently, precisely, every strike on target. Every soldier who scaled the wall met her sword. She didn't kill, she wounded. She knocked them down. She threw them off. After the 4th hour, the baron called off the attack. The army retreated. Do-hyuk stood on the tower and watched as 250 men withdrew from his walls. They left the ladders behind, left the wounded behind, left the battering ram behind. He looked at the interface. Bricks in stock, 12 units, 12 out of 900. If the battle had lasted another hour, the wall would have been dead, without mobility, without self-sustainment, a simple brick wall that mages would have demolished in 20 minutes. He sat down on the floor of the tower. His legs wouldn't hold him up, so Rin sat down beside him. The book in her hand was filled to the last page. She was silent. He was silent. Down below in the square, guards were bandaging the wounded. 3 out of 25. Minor injuries. No one had died. On the baron's side, Do-hyuk wasn't sure. He'd seen at least 20 people on the ground by the wall, wounded, perhaps even dead. He didn't want to think about it. That evening, Hwang Jung-ryol arrived, alone, unarmed. He asked permission to take the wounded away from the wall. Do-hyuk opened the gate. He went out himself to help. He carried enemy soldiers on a stretcher. The guards stared in astonishment. Yi-jin didn't stare. She stood silently beside him and carried the second stretcher. Hwang watched them and said nothing. When the wounded had been taken away, Hwang lingered at the gate. He said quietly that the baron hadn't expected this, that the baron had retreated for 2 days. Then there would be a second assault, with reinforcements, mercenaries from the south, another 100 swordsmen, and more powerful mages. Do-hyuk thanked him for the warning. Hwang shrugged. He said that all sorts of things happen in his line of work, but a wall that moves had appeared in his dream last night, and he wasn't sure it was a good dream. He rode off. Do-hyuk closed the gate. He looked at the empty warehouse. 12 bricks. They wouldn't survive a second assault. He had 2 days, 48 hours. And 12 bricks in the warehouse. Do-hyuk didn't go to bed. He didn't eat. He went out to the square and sat down in the middle of it. People gathered around him. 400 people. They stood in silence, waiting. He didn't know what to say to them. A second assault. 350 soldiers, mages, siege weapons, against 25 militiamen and an empty warehouse. His engineering mind told him the task was unsolvable. No resources, no people, no weapons, no time. Defeat. But the engineer in him knew one more thing. There are no unsolvable problems. There are only problems that are framed incorrectly. He reframed the problem, not as a defense, as a construction project. He didn't need to defeat the army. He needed the army not to want to attack. There's a difference. There was a case in Cambodia. A local official wanted to demolish a village. Until Huke, no one could stop the bulldozers. But overnight, he built a school in the center of the village, with children inside. By morning, when the bulldozers arrived, 200 children were sitting at their desks. Journalists' cameras were set up all around. The official turned the bulldozers around, not because he took pity, because the cost had become too high, making an attack too expensive. Here was the challenge. He stood up, went to the workshop, unfolded the blueprint, began to work. Han Mei arrived 10 minutes later. She looked over his shoulder, asked what he was doing. He said he was rebuilding the settlement. She asked, "For what?" He said, "For surrender." She fell silent. Then she said she didn't understand. He explained. They couldn't win in battle, but they could make the battle cost the barren more than peace. To do that, they had to show that the settlement was more valuable intact than in ruins. The baron wanted the peasants back, but the peasants here produced 3 times as much as on his lands: bricks that didn't crumble, dishes that didn't break, and fabric than linen. Tools that stay sharp, finely ground flour. If the baron destroys the settlement, he destroys all of this, and he'll get back hungry peasants who can't do anything. Or he could leave the settlement alone and trade, buy bricks and pottery and cloth and tools in exchange for the grain he has in abundance. The first option would cost him 300 soldiers and mages and siege weapons and months of campaigning. The second costs him nothing. Han Mei listened. Then she said the plan was good, but the baron might be too proud to see reason. Until Hyuk said that was exactly why he needed more than just trade. He needed a demonstration. He worked all night, not on the wall, on the town. He used the last 12 bricks and everything left in the warehouse: stone, clay, wood, metal. He wasn't fortifying the defenses, he was building. Workshops, new ones, beautiful ones, with signs. A row of shops stretching from the gate to the square. An exhibition. Everything the settlement knew how to make was on display: bricks, pottery, fabric, tools, furniture. Window frames with real glass. Yes, glass. Over the past month, Che Min-ho and Han Mei had been secretly experimenting with sand and a furnace. The first pieces of glass were cloudy and warped, but they were there. Glass. In a world where windows are covered with bull's bladder or mica, glass. Do Hyuk arranged everything along the main street, not like a warehouse, like a fair, so that anyone entering the gates would see not a fortress, but a city. Not walls, but workshops. Not soldiers, but artisans. On the morning of the first day, he opened the gates, wide open. Ijin looked at him as if he were crazy. She said it was madness, that the army was an hour's march away, that open gates were an invitation to a massacre. Do Hyuk said that closed gates were an invitation to an assault, and open gates were an invitation to a conversation. She shook her head. She stood by the gates with a sword. She said that if he wanted to talk, she would stand by in case the conversation didn't. He nodded. Li Na brought her caravan. She set out her goods at the gates, on the outside. She spread out rugs and laid out samples: bricks, tableware, fabric, and glass. She set the prices low, almost at cost, not for profit, to start a conversation. On the second day, the baron's camp stirred. Not the army, quartermasters, supply officers, people who calculate expenses. They came to the gates, not with weapons, with their eyes. They looked at the bricks, at the glass, at the tools. One picked up a brick, tapped it. It rang out. Tried to break it with his hands. Couldn't. Looked at the price, looked at the gate, looked at the city beyond it. Workshops, smoke from the chimneys, the clang of a hammer from the smithy, the creak of the mill. Children running along the cobblestone street. He went back to camp. On the evening of the second day, a horseman rode up to the gate. Not Juan, someone else. A young man, in fine armor, a coat of arms on his chest. Not the crossed hammers of the retinue, the personal coat of arms of the Che clan. The Baron's son. Che Song-woo. He dismounted, alone. He surveyed the row of shops. He picked up a piece of glass. He looked through it at the sun. It was a bit cloudy, but clear. He held it carefully, like a treasure. Then he put it back. He approached the gate. He asked to be let in. Ijin looked at Do-hyuk. Do-hyuk nodded. Sung-woo entered the town. Do-hyuk led him down the street. He showed him the workshops, the blacksmith's shop, the mill, the potter's workshop, the weaver's workshop, and the bakery. The smell of fresh bread wafted from the bakery. Sung-woo stopped. He took a deep breath. He looked at the baker. The baker was an old man of about 60 with a first-level soft dough skill. It was one of those skills that people didn't respect. But the bread he baked was the best on the plateau, perhaps even the best in the region. That's because the cascade had raised his skill to the second level. And the second level for a baker means bread you simply can't stop eating. Do-hyuk gave Sun-woo a piece of bread, hot with a crispy crust. Sun-woo ate in silence. Then he asked how many people lived here. Do-hyuk said 400. Sun-woo asked how many of them were his father's former peasants. Do-hyuk said he hadn't counted by social status. Everyone here is free. Sun-woo nodded. He left. That night, there was an argument in the Baron's camp, a loud one. The voices carried all the way to the walls. In the morning, the army broke camp. They didn't launch an assault. They broke camp and left. All 250 spears, all the mages, all the ladders. They turned around and headed south. Do-hyuk stood on the tower and watched. So-rin stood beside him. Han-mei stood beside him. Li-na stood beside him. Ye-jin stood beside him. The 5 of them on the tower watched as the army departed. Li-na said that the Baron's son was no fool, and that in a week a trade caravan bearing the Choi coat of arms would arrive here. She was right. 5 days later, a caravan from the Choi estate delivered 10 sacks of grain and 3 sacks of iron. It took away bricks, tableware, and 2 pieces of glass. The following week, a second caravan arrived. It was larger. Li-na sat in her trading hall beneath the Na clan's coat of arms and smiled that smile that makes people sign unfavorable contracts. But the contracts were beneficial to both sides. Do-hyuk had insisted on it. A month later, 800 people lived in the settlement. Brick houses instead of mud ones. A second mill on room. A third kiln. A glass workshop. A full-fledged school, the first in the settlement. Do-hyuk spent longer building it than any of the other structures, 3 days. Not because it was complicated, it was because he designed each classroom for specific children. A classroom for the little ones, low desks, heated floors, large windows to let in light. A classroom for the older children, taller desks, a blackboard on the wall, shelves with books from So-rin's reading room. A classroom for adults, evening classes for those who wanted to learn to read and count. There were many of them. Half the residents didn't know the alphabet. So-rin became a teacher, not by appointment, just by default. She knew every resident, knew who could do what. She knew what each person needed. And she knew every book in her reading room. She taught the children in the morning, the adults in the evening. Between classes, she kept track of the settlement's affairs. She took notes. She counted. She planned. Even Hyok watched her and thought she did more for the settlement than he did. He built walls. She built what lay within those walls. People. One evening, he sat on the steps and watched as So-rin left the school. Children ran past, laughing. One boy turned around and shouted to her that he'd be the first to arrive tomorrow. She waved at him, smiled, quietly, just the corners of her lips. And Do-hyuk realized he'd been staring at her for a full minute without looking away. He turned away, stared at his hands, dirty with clay, calloused, with a blister on his right hand. The body of a 16-year-old, the mind of a 27-year-old. She was 25. He didn't know what to do about it.
So he decided to do nothing, because he had to keep building, and because he was afraid. Not of her, of himself. Afraid that if he allowed himself to feel this way, he wouldn't be able to stop. And he didn't know how to stop. At all. Sorin brought him tea. 2 cups, as always. She set them down beside him. They were sitting on the steps, looking out at the square. Children were playing. Old people were arguing by the well. The sound of bells rang out from the blacksmith shop. The smell of bread wafted from the bakery. The mill creaked. Smoke rose from the chimneys. The town was alive. And for the first time in 6 months, Do-hyuk thought that maybe this wasn't just a project. Maybe this was home. The 6th month brought the first snow to the plateau, and the first ambassador. The snow settled in a thin layer on the red brick roofs and on Oh Soo-yeon's hanging garden beds, which she refused to take down until the very last moment. The ambassador had arrived from the kingdom of Nami, a tall man in a silk robe with a gold brooch on his chest. Behind him were 4 servants and a dozen guards in polished armor. They entered the gate and stopped. The ambassador looked at the city, at the cobblestone streets, at the glass windows, at the school from which children's voices could be heard, at the mill, at the blacksmith shop, at the row of shops where Lee Na was receiving a caravan from the eastern villages. The guards looked at the wall, at the 5-meter-high brickwork, at the towers, at the battlements, at Sun Yi-jin, who stood by the gate with a sword at her belt, and looked at them so intently that 2 of the 10 involuntarily placed their hands on their hilt. The ambassador's name was Moon Tae-hyun. He spoke politely, he smiled, he bowed, and every word was wrapped in 3 layers of silk. He said that King Namhae was delighted with the young builder's achievements, that the Baekung-hee Plateau was formally part of the kingdom's territory, that the king would be pleased to take the settlement under his protection, as a vassal, with all the rights and obligations that entailed, taxes, military conscription, and submission to the laws of the crown, in exchange for the protection of the royal army and the right to trade in Namhae's markets. Do-hyuk listened. So-rin stood behind him, a notebook in her hand, writing down every word. Do-hyuk offered the ambassador some tea. Real tea, made from the dried herbs Ha-eun had been growing in the southern garden beds. He didn't know her name yet. She would arrive later. But the herbs were already growing in the beds. Oh Soo-yeon had found wild varieties on the hillside and had transplanted them into the greenhouse. The tea was bitter, with a honeyed aftertaste. The ambassador sipped it and waited for an answer. Do-hyuk said he was grateful to the king for the offer, and that he was declining. The ambassador stopped smiling. He asked if the village head understood what refusing vassalage meant, that the settlement would be left without the crown's protection, that any baron or count could attack, and the crown would not intervene, that the trade routes through Namhae's lands would be closed. Do-hyuk said he understood, and that the trade routes through Baron Cho's lands were open, and through the eastern villages, and through the northern pass, and that the settlement didn't need protection because the walls were sufficient on their own. The ambassador finished his tea. He stood up. He bowed. He said he would convey the answer to the king, and that the king would be distressed. He pronounced the last word in such a way that So-rin wrote it down twice and underlined it. The ambassador left. Do-hyuk stood at the gate and watched as the entourage disappeared down the path. Lee Na approached. She said that he had just declared war on the kingdom of Namhae. Do-hyuk said that he had declared independence. Those are different things. Lee Na said that for kings, it was one and the same. She was right. 2 months later, Lee Na, a spy from the capital of Namhae, brought news. The king was gathering an army, not a baron's retinue, but a royal one. 12,000 spears, siege towers, high-ranking battle mages, an entire army for a single settlement. It was flattering and deadly. Do-hyuk received this news over dinner. He set his chopsticks down on the table. He looked at So-rin. She already knew,
from the look on his face. She asked how many. He said 12,000. She jotted down the number. Her hand didn't waver. Then she closed her notebook. She looked at him. She said they had time. He asked how much. She said an army of that size takes half a year to assemble, plus the march. Plus winter, that means spring. About a year since the exile, maybe a little more. Do-hyuk did the math. Half a year. In half a year, he'd grown the settlement from 5 people to 800. Over the next half year, he could grow it to 10,000, to 20,000, to 50,000. But 50,000 peasants wouldn't stop 12,000 trained soldiers, not by sheer numbers. He needed something else. He opened the interface. He looked at his skill progress. Small settlement, level 3, 40% to level 4. Each level unlocked something new. First, construction. Second, specialization tree. Third, living plan. Fourth, unknown. Fifth, unknown. Sixth, unknown. Seventh. He remembered a line he'd seen in the interface a long time ago. Small, gray, barely noticeable. Levitation. Unlocks at level 7. Levitation. A city that flies. He hadn't told anyone about it. By the end of the first year, 12,000 people were living on the plateau. The interface flashed and changed its status. The settlement became a city. Stage 4. New functions unfolded before Do-hyuk like a scroll. Each line changed the rules. Labor coordination. Now he could assign tasks through the interface, not orders. Suggestions. Residents saw a flickering prompt in their minds. A carpenter is needed on the east wall. A mason is needed at the 5th house. They could accept. They could refuse. But the system knew who was available and who was suitable. Construction efficiency doubled in a week. Enhanced cascade. Now the residents' skills were enhanced not by 1 or 2 levels, but by 2 or 3. Park Yeon-gil rose to the 6th level of carpentry. 6th level is that of a master who senses wood as if it were alive. He would touch a log and know where it would split in a year. He knew which board to cut so it wouldn't warp. The old man stood in his workshop and wept quietly. He was 63. He had been at the 3rd level his entire life. A village carpenter. Good, but ordinary. And now his hands were creating what he had only ever seen in his dreams. Bae Jong-guk, the blacksmith, had reached the 5th level. The 5th level of a blacksmith is weapons. Real ones. Not village knives, but swords that sing in the hand. Yi-jin received the first sword he had forged. She held it up to the light, she at the blade. Then she looked at the blacksmith. She said it was the finest blade she'd seen in 10 years of service. The blacksmith blushed to his ears and went into the forge. 12,000 people. That's no longer a village or a small town. It's a city, with the problems of a city. Sewer systems. Do-hyuk spent 3 nights drawing up the plans. Han Mei was right beside him. They sat in the workshop and argued over pipe diameters and the slope of the drains. At 3 in the morning, she fell asleep at the table, her face resting on the blueprint. Do-hyuk took off his jacket. He draped it over her shoulders. She didn't wake up. He looked at her short hair falling across her forehead, at the scrapes on her fingers, at the streak of soot on her cheek. And for the first time, he allowed himself to think that she was beautiful. Then he turned away. He went back to the blueprint. He worked until dawn. In the morning, she woke up. She saw the jacket on her shoulders. She looked at him. He was sitting at the table, drawing. He didn't look up. She took off the jacket and hung it on the back of his chair. She didn't say a word. She left. She returned 10 minutes later with 2 bowls of porridge. Silently, she set one in front of him. Silently, she sat down with hers. They ate and drew at the same time. The 8th month. His skill had reached the 5th level, zonal control. Now Do-hyuk could sense every building in the city as if it were part of his own body, not through thought, through sensation. He knew that the 3rd roof tile on the roof of house number 47 had cracked. He knew that the left-hand bellows in the blacksmith shop were leaking. He knew that the windowsill of the second window at the school had warped from dampness. He felt all of this just as a person feels a splinter in their finger. And he could fix it mentally, without a blueprint, without an interface. He simply thought about it, and the skill corrected it. It was terrifying, and it was beautiful. The 9th month, the 6th stage, 20,000 residents, architectural resonance. The buildings began to reinforce one another. The wall next to the blacksmith shop grew stronger from the heat of the forge. The roof next to the mill drained water better due to the vibration of the wheel. The city didn't just stand there. The city functioned as a single mechanism where every part aided the one next to it. Hanmei studied this for weeks. She walked around with a hammer and tapped the walls. She took notes. She drew diagrams. She came to Do-hyuk with a thick stack of notes and told him that his city violated every law of construction she knew. That a wall made of ordinary brick couldn't be stronger than steel. But this one was. Because there was a smithy nearby, and the resonance of skill transferred the properties of metal to the stone. Do-hyuk said it wasn't magic. It was architecture, just a different kind. She said it was one and the same, and that she wanted to understand how it worked, and that to do that, she needed a tower, a tall one, so she could see the whole city from above. He built her a tower, the very next day. That evening, she climbed to the top. She stood on the roof. The wind ruffled her short hair. The city lay below, lights in the windows, smoke from the chimneys, the lines of the streets. The pattern she'd only ever seen on a blueprint now lay at her feet, alive and breathing. Do-hyuk followed her up. He stood beside her. They looked out at the city, in silence. The first snow of winter fell in fine flakes, settling on the rooftops, on their shoulders. She said quietly that it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life. He said that this was only the beginning. She turned toward him. He turned toward her. Snow fell between them. She reached out and brushed a snowflake from his collar. Her fingers lingered for a second. Then she withdrew her hand. She turned away. She said that the foundation of the South Tower had settled by 2 fingers' width, and they needed to add more mortar. He said he'd do it in the morning. They went downstairs, each to their own workshop. Sorin waited on the steps, with 2 cups of tea. She'd seen them coming down from the tower, together, with snow on their shoulders. Do-hyuk sat down next to her. He took a cup. Sorin was silent, longer than usual. Then she said the tower had turned out beautifully. Her voice was steady, her face was calm, but her fingers tightened slightly around the book. Do-hyuk drank his tea and hated himself, because he couldn't choose, and he understood that by not choosing, he was causing pain to both of them. The 10th month, 40,000 residents. The city buzzed like a beehive. His skill was approaching the 7th level, 90%. Do-hyuk felt it as pressure in his temples. Something huge was about to unfold in the interface, something that would change everything. And it was at that very moment that she appeared on the northern road. Jung Ha-eun, a 19-year-old girl with a sack of seeds and the eyes of someone who had seen their world burn. She came alone, from the village that Hwaryeon's troops had burned down a month ago. In the sack were seeds her grandmother had collected her whole life. She hadn't been able to save her grandmother, but she had saved the seeds. She stood at the gate and asked for nothing. She just stood there, with the sack on her shoulders. Hyuk approached her. He asked what was in the sack. She said seeds, southern herbs, medicinal ones, jasmine, gentian, moon sage, 42 varieties, her grandmother's collection. He asked what she needed. She said soil, warm, moist, for southern plants that wouldn't survive on the plateau in open ground. He didn't build her a greenhouse. He built hanging gardens on the south wall, stone terraces cascading down the wall in steps, enclosed by glass frames. Inside, warmth from the stove flue that he routed through the base of the terraces, humidity from the drip irrigation system that Hanmei assembled from clay tubes. The microclimate was just like in the south, warm, humid, with morning mist from condensation on the glass. Ha-eun entered the gardens. She untied the sack. She took out the first bundle. She unwrapped it. Jasmine seeds. Her grandmother's jasmine. She planted them. A week later, the bush bloomed. Over the precipice, 5 meters up, on the city wall in the middle of a plateau where nothing grows. White flowers. The scent was sweet and warm. The scent of her grandmother's house, which no longer exists. Hyun stood in front of the bush, silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. Do-hyuk stood behind her. He said nothing. She turned around. She buried her face in his shoulder. He stood there, motionless. He didn't hug her. He just stood there, like a wall. Because sometimes a person doesn't need arms. They need a wall to rest their forehead against, knowing it won't budge. The seventh step came on the night of the winter solstice. Do-hyuk hadn't slept. He was sitting in his workshop, poring over a foundation blueprint that had been stumping him for 3 weeks. The problem lay in the GE metrology. The city was growing upward. 3-story houses, towers, workshops with high ceilings. The weight was pressing down on the foundation. The sandstone plateau couldn't hold it. Cracks ran through the foundation like wrinkles across an old face. He tried different solutions: deep piles, distributed pads, stone stiffening ribs. Nothing worked. Or rather, it worked, but only temporarily. The city was growing faster than he could reinforce the foundation. And at 2 in the morning, he drew a torus. Without thinking, his hand traced the line on its own. A ring-shaped foundation with a hollow center. Like a bagel. The load is distributed evenly around the ring. The pressure on the ground is cut in half. The void inside the ring acts as a damper. It absorbs vibration. He looked at the drawing and realized he'd seen this shape before. In an aerodynamics textbook, a toroidal frame, a shape that distributes the load and simultaneously generates lift when a flow passes through it. A flow, the veins of the sky. He remembered. There was an old map in Soren's archive, a very old one. It marked lines that ancient mages called the veins of the sky, air currents of invisible energy. Everyone considered them useless. Mages tried to draw power from them, but couldn't. The currents were too scattered, too weak for spells. But if you channeled them through a toroidal frame, concentration, like a lens focusing scattered light into a single point, the ring-shaped foundation gathers the scattered currents into lifting force. His hand trembled. He drew the final line. The interface flashed, white, bright. For a second, he was blinded. When his vision returned, a new panel hung before him. Small settlement, level 7, new function, levitation. The city can rise into the air if certain conditions are met. The toroidal foundation is complete. A population of at least 100,000. Consent of the residents. Until now, Hyuk had been sitting in his workshop, staring at those lines. 100,000. He had 40. He needed 60 more. And the toroidal foundation, which he had just sketched. He stepped out onto the street. The city was asleep. Silence. Snow. Lights in the windows of the watchtowers. He stood in the middle of the street and gazed at the stars. Somewhere up there, his city would be suspended, amid the clouds, just like in the legends of the celestial city that collapsed 1,000 years ago. He returned to his workshop. He unfolded the foundation blueprint and began to recalculate. A toroidal framework beneath the entire city, every building on the ring, every wall part of the overall structure. That meant rebuilding the foundation from scratch, under a functioning city, without bringing life to a halt. Like changing a train's wheels while it's moving. Han Mei came in the morning. He showed her the blueprint. She looked at it for 10 minutes. Then she looked up. Her eyes were huge. She said it was impossible. He said it was possible. She said that rebuilding the foundation beneath a city of 40,000 people without bringing the city to a standstill was madness. He said that was engineering. She said one didn't preclude the other. And she sat down next to him. She picked up a pencil and began to calculate. They worked for 3 months. Winter, spring, the most grueling construction project in the settlement's history. Section by section, block by block. They dug up the old foundation, poured a new one, a ring foundation. Residents moved into temporary housing while their block was being rebuilt. Then they returned, and so on in a circle. The entire city, 500 buildings, one after another. Hyuk hadn't slept properly for 3 months. 4 hours here, 3 hours there. So Rin brought him food to the workshop because he forgot to eat. Han Mei brought him blueprints because she forgot he'd already received yesterday's. Li Na brought him news because the outside world wasn't standing still. Namhae's army had advanced, 12,000 spearmen, battle mages, siege towers. They moved slowly, winter, roads, snow, but they advanced. And Do Hyuk knew that by spring they would be at the foot of the plateau. Somewhere to the west, the Hwaryong Empire was devouring yet another principality. Emperor Gang Chul sat on his throne and waited. His spies had long been reporting on the city on the plateau, on the skill called small settlement, on the walls that heal themselves, on the building that enhances skills. But the emperor did not move, not yet. He waited for the city and Namhae to destroy each other. Then he would come and claim the ruins. In the middle of the second year, a red-haired woman with freckles and an accent appeared on the caravan trail. She was traveling with Li Na's caravan, quiet, wary, with the eyes of someone who had been in hiding for a year. Li Na brought her to Do Hyuk. She said she was a cartographer, a good one, and that she was strange. Do Hyuk looked at the red-haired woman. She looked at him. He offered her a seat. They talked over lunch. She introduced herself as Emily, a cartographer and meteorologist. She knows the winds and the climate. She can draw up a weather map for the plateau, useful for agriculture. Do Hyuk nodded. He ate his porridge. He listened. And at some point, in passing, he blurted out a phrase. He didn't even think about it. It just slipped out. He said he remembered learning about the windrows in school. Emily dropped her spoon. The sound of metal on stone. Silence. She looked at him. He looked at her. 2 seconds. 3. 5. Then she said one word in English. "Where are you from?" He replied in Korean. "Seoul." She covered her mouth with her hand. Her eyes glistened. Then she stood up. She stepped away from the table. She walked around the corner of the house. Do Hyuk could hear her crying, not quietly, out loud. A year. She had lived in this world for a year, alone with her knowledge. A year pretending to be a local. A year afraid that if anyone found out, they would burn her. Strangers here were burned as emissaries of the lying tree. She thought she'd be alone forever. And now, here was a boy with clay under his fingernails talking about the compass rose in standard Korean, as if they were sitting in a cafe in Gangnam rather than in a medieval town atop a mountain. Do Hyuk followed her outside. He stood beside her. He was silent. When she stopped crying, he said he would build her an observatory. She laughed through her tears. She said in English that he was crazy. He said in Korean that he was, and that the observatory would have a retractable dome. Spring of the second year. The city had grown to 70,000. The toroidal foundation was complete. The ring beneath the city was ready. 30,000 people and 2 or 3 weeks remained until the population reached 100,000. Namhae's army was 2 days' march away. Yejin's scouts had spotted their camp from the pass. 12,000 spears, siege towers, battle mages, the king's banners. Do Hyuk convened a council, a full one, with Sorin, Han Mei, Li Na, Song Ye-jin, Jung Ha-eun, Emily, Park Young-gil, Baek Jung-guk, Che Min-ho, Kang Du-shik. 11 people at the table. Do Hyuk told the truth, that the city could rise into the air, that it would take 100,000 residents to do so, that they had 70,000, and that the army would be here before they could recruit the rest. Silence fell at the table. Then Li Na spoke up. She said that over the past 2 weeks, caravans of refugees had piled up on the roads leading to the plateau. Thousands of them. From the north, where the stone giants have awakened and are ravaging villages. From the west, where Hwaryong is burning border settlements. From the south, where the Namhae army is ravaging its own lands through mobilization and extortion. Everyone is heading here. The rumor of the city on the plateau has reached every corner of Samgyeon. A city that builds homes for everyone. A city where people can improve their skills.
A city where no one is beaten for being weak.
Li Na said that if we open all the trails and direct the caravans, we could take in 20,000 people in 10 days, maybe 30,000. But that would be chaos. Food, housing, water, sewage. The city is perfectly designed for 70,000. For 100,000, there wouldn't be enough of anything. Then Hyuk said that would be enough. Li Na raised an eyebrow. He said that if he started drawing right now and didn't stop, in 10 days he'd design housing for 30,000 people. According to his rule, a separate room for everyone. So Rin said quietly that he'd die in 10 days without sleep. He looked at her. She was looking at him. No tears, no fear. With that expression he knew so well. Don't. She was telling him not to. He said he wouldn't die, that he had 5th-level zonal control, that he didn't need to draw on paper. He could draw on his head, and his skill would build it simultaneously. Han Mei said she would take care of the infrastructure. Sewers, water supply, roads. He would only have to deal with the houses. Li Na said she would open all the warehouses and let all the caravans through. There would be enough materials. Ijin said the guards would man the walls and hold them while he worked. Hayun said her gardens would feed the extra mouths. Herbal infusions, medicinal teas, everything that can be grown in 10 days. Emily said she'd forecast the weather. If there's a downpour or a storm, she needs to be warned in advance. Park Yeon-gil said his carpenters are ready, 200 people, around the clock. Do Hyuk looked at them, at everyone, at the 11 faces around the table. Everyone was ready. Everyone knew their place. Everyone offered not help, but responsibility. He didn't build this alone. He built this together with them, and now they were building it together without him. Because the city wasn't him, the city is all of them. He said he was starting, 10 days, 10 nights. He sat in the workshop, sometimes on the tower, sometimes in the middle of the square. People poured through the gates in a stream, families, lone travelers, old people with carts, children carried in their mother's arms, convoys, caravans, crowds. So Rin stood at the gates, with a notebook. She counted. She wrote down names, skills, age, where they came from, where they were going, what they needed. Han Mei ran around the city with a hammer and blueprints. She laid pipes. She widened wells. She built new outhouses. Li Na unloaded the caravans. She managed the warehouses. She fed everyone. Yi Jin kept order, calmly, without shouting. Ha-eun handed out herbal decoctions to the sick. Emily watched the sky. Do Hyuk drew plans, each house for a specific person. He would ask their names, what they did for a living, which side they slept on, whether they were afraid of the dark, and he would sketch, quickly, in his head. He developed his skill at the same time. Invisible hands raised the walls faster than ever before. 3rd level, 1 building in half a day. 7th level, 10 buildings in an hour. The city grew before their eyes. Neighborhoods sprang up from the ground like mushrooms after rain. Houses, workshops, shops, bathhouses, laundromats, everything. On the 4th day, So Rin came into the workshop, silently. She sat down beside him. She took his hand. He didn't notice that his hands were shaking. She did. She said he should sleep for at least 2 hours. He said, later. She didn't leave. She sat beside him, holding his hand. An hour later, he fell asleep, sitting up, with a blueprint in his head. She didn't let go of his hand. 2 hours. Then he woke up. He looked at her. She was looking at him. He said, "Thank you." She told him not to dare die. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were red. He nodded. He stood up. He went to draw. On the 7th day, the population reached 90,000. On the 8th, 95,000. Name's army stood at the foot of the plateau. They had set up camp. They were waiting for morning. Siege towers were lined up in a row. Mages were warming up. Commanders were checking the formation. 12,000 spears were preparing for the assault. On the 9th day, 98,000. On the 10th, night. Do-hyuk sat in the square. The city slept around him. 100,000 people. The interface flashed. Conditions met. Toroidal foundation complete. Population 100,000. Residents consent. Confirmation required. Residents' consent. He couldn't ask 100,000 people, but the interface already knew. A living plan, a city that senses its residents, a city that knows what they want. 100,000 people came here because they had nowhere else to go, and each of them chose to stay. That is consent. He pressed confirm. Nothing happened. For now. Dawn came pink and quiet. No wind, no clouds. The sky above the plateau was as clear as glass from Che Minho's workshop. Do-hyuk stood on the wall, alone, in a work jacket smeared with chalk and clay. Below, at the foot of the plateau, 12,000 spears were forming in battle formation. The first line, infantry with ladders and battering rams. The second line, shield bearers. The third line, mages. Fireballs were already smoldering in their palms. The fourth line, cavalry. And in the center, on a raven-black horse beneath a golden banner, King Namhae himself. Young, 26 years old, a fourth-level master of thunder, a battle-hardened king. He had come in person to crush the rebel on the plateau. Do-hyuk looked at the army. He counted out of habit. 12,000, 4 siege towers, at least 100 mages. It was a force against which his walls would not stand for even an hour. 5-meter-thick brick against 100 fire mages. The math was simple. The wall would fall in 20 minutes. The city would be burning in an hour. 100,000 people on the road by morning, if he was lucky. He had no intention of testing that math. Behind him stood the city, the schools where So Rin taught children to read, the workshops where Han Mei mapped out the future, the trading hall where Li Na built the network that fed half of Samgyeon, the barracks where Yi Jin regained her honor, the hanging gardens where Ha Un grew her grandmother's jasmine, the observatory where Emily felt at home for the first time in 2 years, a blacksmith shop, a mill, a bakery, a library, bathhouses, laundromats, 100,000 rooms for 100,000 people. Every door bears a name. A city is neither a banner nor a fortress. A city is a covenant. I built you a home. You stayed. We're together. He raised his hand, slowly, like a draftsman drawing a line on paper. Not with a sudden jerk, not with a shout. Quietly, precisely, as always. In the interface, he saw everything. Every building, every wall, every stone, every beam, every nail. And beneath it all, a ring. A toroidal foundation. The framework they'd spent 3 months building with Han Mei, section by section, stone by stone. He activated levitation, not with a button, with his mind. A 7th-level skill obeyed his thoughts faster than his hands. The earth trembled, not strongly, like a sigh, as if someone enormous had rolled over in their sleep. A wave swept through the city, not destructive, gentle, like ripples on water. The window panes rang out softly. Children woke up. The elderly came out into the streets. Dogs began to bark. Then they fell silent. A rumbling began beneath the city, a low bass sound, as if a huge bell had begun to ring underground. The veins of the sky, streams that mages had always considered useless, scattered, weak, good for nothing. The toroidal frame gathered them, it concentrated them, coiled them into a ring, and the ring generated lift. Do-hyuk stood on the wall and felt the earth beneath the city separating from the plateau, not tearing, peeling away, gently, like a sheet of paper from a table. A crack ran along the perimeter, smooth, precise, along the line of the torus. The city stood on a stone disk 1.5 kilometers wide, and this disk slowly rose, 1 centimeter, 10, a meter. The army below froze. 12,000 men looked up. Spears froze. Commands fell silent. Mages lowered their hands. Fireballs went out. The city rose, silently, smoothly, meter by meter. The foundation stones did not crumble. The earth did not crumble away. The disk rose as a single, solid unit, as if a giant hand were lifting a saucer from a table. Do-hyuk stood on the wall and led. He wasn't giving orders, he was conducting, just as a conductor leads an orchestra. Every building was an instrument, every wall a note, and they all sounded together. The city was singing, not a metaphor. The toroidal framework vibrated, and the city hummed on a single note. Low, deep, beautiful. So Rin stood behind him. She approached quietly, stood beside him, didn't touch him, just stood there. He sensed her presence just as he sensed every building in the city. She was part of it, like a reading room, like the school, like the book on his belt. Han Mei stood on her tower. She looked down at the receding ground, at the blueprint that had become reality. Her blueprint, too. Every buttress, every arch, every load calculation. She had built this together with him. Li Na stood in the trading hall beneath the Na clan's crest and watched through the window as the clouds drew near. Yi Jin stood by the gates that now opened onto the sky. A sword at her belt, back straight, she was guarding the city, even in the air. Ha Yun stood in her hanging gardens and wept. Her grandmother's jasmine was in bloom, above the clouds. Emily stood in the observatory, watching the instruments. The barometer showed the impossible. The pressure was stable, at an altitude of 300 meters, just like on the ground. The toroidal frame wasn't just lifting the city, it was creating a zone of stable pressure inside the ring. She was writing down the numbers. Her hands were shaking. She was writing in English, for the first time in 2 years, because there was someone nearby who could read it. The city hovered, at an altitude of 300 meters above the plateau. Its shadow fell over the army camp. Huge, round. 12,000 soldiers stood in the shadow of the flying city, unable to raise their spears, not because of magic, because of shock. King Nami sat on his horse and looked up. His mouth was slightly open. For the first time in the history of Sambyeon, a man saw what he had considered impossible. A city in the sky, just like in legends, just like in the bedtime stories told to children. Only this wasn't a fairy tale. It was brick and stone and glass and wood, and 100,000 people who decided they had somewhere to go. Do-hyuk lowered his hand. He turned to Sorin. She was standing beside him. Her face was calm. Her eyes were wet. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were just wet. He said, sounding very tired, "Well, that's it. Now it'll be quiet." She took his hand. Her fingers were warm, strong. She didn't answer. They both knew the answer was no, it wouldn't be quiet. There would be Hwaryeon. There would be an emperor. There would be the stone giants. There would be 1,000 problems that couldn't be solved just by climbing 300 meters. But right now, at this very moment, the city hung in the morning light. The sun gilded the rooftops. The wind carried the scent of jasmine from the hanging gardens. Children ran out into the streets and pointed down at the clouds. Old people stood at their windows and said nothing. Some were crying, some were laughing, some were just watching and realizing that the world had changed forever. Below, the army stood. It didn't leave. It didn't attack. It stood. The way people stand before something too big to comprehend. An hour later, one soldier stuck his spear into the ground. He took off his helmet. He sat down. 10 minutes later, 20 were sitting beside him. An hour later, the entire front line was sitting on the ground. By noon, the army began to disperse. Without an order, without a command, people simply got up and left, because you can't storm the sky. King Nami sat on his horse until evening, alone. He looked up. Then he turned his horse around and rode away. Without a word, without a gesture, he simply rode away. Far to the west, in the black tower of Hwaryeong, a messenger ran into the throne room. He fell to his knees. He gasped out his report. Emperor Ganchol listened. His face was motionless, like stone. Messenger finished. He fell silent. The throne room froze. Emperor Ganchol stood up. For the first time in 20 years, the courtiers recoiled. He stood there, tall, thin, old, his hands like the branches of a dead tree. He walked toward the window, step by step, slowly. The soles of his shoes scraped against the stone. He stood at the window. He looked east, toward the city that should not exist, hanging beyond the mountains and clouds. He stood there for a long time. Then he said one word to his chancellor, who stood behind him, white as a wall. One word: saddle up. Do-hyuk didn't know about this. He stood on the wall of his flying city, holding So-rin's hand. Han-mei approached. She stood on the other side, shoulder to shoulder. Li-na climbed onto the wall. She stood beside them. Yi-jin stood behind him. Ha-eun ran up with a jasmine twig in her hair. Emily was the last to arrive. She stood slightly to the side, as was her custom. But Do-hyuk turned and nodded at her. She stepped closer. The 7 of them on the wall, the city in the sky, the world below. Do-hyuk gazed at the horizon. Far to the west, clouds swirled. Hwaryan. Far to the north, something was moving in the mountains, the stone giants. Far to the south, the roads were clogged with refugees. Everyone was heading for the plateau, which no longer existed, because the plateau was now in the sky. War lay ahead. Ahead lay the emperor. Ahead lay the mystery of the tree, the fragments of an ancient skill, and the list of 17 names in Hwaryan's archives. Everything lay ahead, but for now, the sun, the wind, Jasmine, So-rin's warm hand in his, the city he had built, room by room, person by person, name by name. He hadn't conquered Samgyong, he had raised it up, and this was only the beginning. So-rin squeezed his fingers, quietly. He squeezed back, and somewhere deep within the city, in a reading room with shelves just her height, a window facing east, and a niche perfectly sized for her cup, a small book on the table lay open to its last page, and on that page, in her handwriting, was a single sentence. He isn't building a city, he's building a home for everyone, and we're all finally home.